Another quiet night, another long stretch where your mind won't cooperate. Happens to all of us sooner or later, so let's make it easier. Settle into the sound of the rain, and I'll read you 5 stories, slow, steady, and gentle enough to drift off to. Take your time. Story 1. The neighbor who sat outside my door. She was already there when I came home from work, sitting cross-legged on the hallway floor with her back against the wall opposite my apartment door. I'd never seen her before. The building had 12 units spread across 3 floors, and I knew most of my neighbors by sight, if not by name. The elderly couple in 2A who argued about crossword puzzles, the young professional in 3C who jogged every morning at 5, the family with the toddler on the ground floor whose laughter echoed up the stairwell on good days. But this woman was a stranger, mid-40s, maybe older, with graying hair pulled back in a loose ponytail and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. She was wearing a pale blue cardigan over a floral dress, the kind of outfit my grandmother might have worn to church, and her hands were folded neatly in her lap like she was waiting for something. I stopped at the top of the stairs, keys already in my hand. That automatic hesitation you develop when you live alone in a city and learn to assess every unfamiliar situation before walking into it. She looked up at me with eyes that were pale and watery, the color of dishwater, and something in her expression made me want to turn around and leave. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my distance. "Are you looking for someone?" She didn't answer, just kept looking at me with those flat, colorless eyes, her hands still folded, her body perfectly still. Not threatening exactly, but not reassuring either, like a mannequin that had learned to breathe. My name is Jonah Whitfield. I was 33 that autumn, working as a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center downtown, living alone in apartment 3B of a converted Victorian that had been divided into units sometime in the 70s. I'd moved in 2 years earlier after a bad breakup and a worse depressive episode, and the apartment had become a kind of sanctuary, small but private, quiet but not isolated, the kind of place where I could rebuild myself without anyone watching too closely. The woman outside my door felt like a violation of that sanctuary. Not because she was doing anything wrong, sitting in a hallway isn't a crime, but because her presence disrupted the careful equilibrium I'd constructed. I didn't know her. She didn't belong here. And the way she was looking at me made something cold settle into the base of my spine. "I'm going to go inside now," I said, more to assert control than because I thought she'd try to stop me. "If you need something, you should talk to the building manager. His office is on the 1st floor." I walked past her, close enough to smell something faint and floral, lavender maybe, or old soap, and unlocked my door. She didn't move, didn't turn her head to follow me, just kept staring at the space where I'd been standing. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, locking both the deadbolt and the chain with hands that were steadier than they should have been. Through the peephole, I could see her still sitting there, still motionless, still waiting. I told myself she'd be gone by morning. Probably a relative visiting someone in the building, confused about which floor she was supposed to be on. Maybe someone with dementia who'd wandered away from a caregiver and gotten lost. There were reasonable explanations for strange behavior, and I'd spent enough time in healthcare to know that the most unsettling situations usually had the most mundane causes. But she wasn't gone by morning. When I left for work at 7, she was still there. Same position, same folded hands, same blank expression. Her eyes tracked me as I stepped into the hallway, followed me as I walked toward the stairs, and I felt them on my back the whole way down. I almost said something, almost stopped to ask if she was okay, but something held me back, some instinct that said engaging with her would make things worse. I mentioned it to the building manager on my way out. Gerald was a retired plumber who'd been running the building for 15 years, a no-nonsense guy who'd seen pretty much everything tenant life could throw at him. He frowned when I described the woman and said he'd check it out, but something in his expression shifted when I mentioned which floor she was on. "Outside 3B?" he asked. "You're sure?" She was sitting right across from my door. Couldn't miss her. Gerald was quiet for a moment, his frown deepening into something I couldn't read. "I'll take care of it," he said finally. "Don't worry about it. Probably just someone who got confused." But when I came home that evening, she was there again. Same spot, same position, same pale eyes that found me the moment I reached the top of the stairs. Gerald hadn't taken care of anything. This time, I didn't try to talk to her, just walked past, unlocked my door, and shut myself inside, checked the peephole. She hadn't moved, hadn't reacted, just sat there like she'd been carved from stone, watching the space where my door met the frame. I called Gerald that night and got his voicemail. Called again the next morning, left another message. He never called back. When I knocked on his office door, it was locked and the lights were off. One of my neighbors, the jogger from 3C, said she'd seen him leaving the building the day before with a suitcase, looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The woman stayed. Day after day, she appeared in the hallway outside my apartment, always in the same spot, always with the same folded hands and blank expression. She never spoke, never moved, never seemed to eat or drink or use the bathroom. I started timing her appearances. She'd be there when I left in the morning, gone when I checked around noon, back again by the time I returned from work. Like clockwork, like ritual. I asked my other neighbors if they'd seen her. Most of them looked at me strangely and said they didn't know what I was talking about. The hallway was always empty when they passed through it. No woman in a blue cardigan, no one sitting outside 3B, nothing unusual at all. But I saw her. Every single day, I saw her. And on the 7th night, when I checked the peephole before going to bed, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. She wasn't sitting across from my door anymore. She was standing directly in front of it, her face inches from the peephole, those pale eyes staring straight through the glass like she could see me on the other side. And for the first time since she'd appeared, she was smiling. I didn't sleep that night. Sat on my couch with every light on, watching the door like it might swing open at any moment, listening for sounds in the hallway that never came. The silence was almost worse than noise would have been. That absolute stillness on the other side of the wall, knowing she was out there, knowing she was waiting, knowing that something had changed, and I had no idea what it meant. When dawn finally came, gray light seeping through my curtains, I checked the peephole again. She was gone. The hallway was empty, the carpet undisturbed, nothing to suggest anyone had been standing there for hours with their face pressed to my door. I unlocked the deadbolt and the chain, opened the door just a crack, and peered out. Nothing. Just the familiar corridor, the other apartment doors, the stairwell at the far end catching the first pale light of morning. I called in sick to work. Couldn't face the idea of leaving my apartment, of walking past the spot where she'd been sitting for a week, of coming home to find her there again. Instead, I started researching. The building, the apartment, anything I could find about the history of 3B and why a woman only I could see had decided to make the hallway outside my door her permanent residence. The building had been converted to apartments in 1974, but the house itself was much older, built in 1902, according to property records, by a family named Aldrich who'd lived there until the patriarch died in 1969. After that, it had been sold to a developer who'd carved it into 12 units and rented them out to students and young professionals looking for cheap housing close to downtown. The conversion had been unremarkable, the decades since uneventful, no major incidents or tragedies that I could find in any public record. But then I found the forum post. It was buried deep in a local history website, a thread from 2008 about haunted locations in the city that had mostly devolved into arguments about whether ghosts were real. Someone with the username oldtimer_Pete had posted a single comment near the bottom of the thread, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Anyone remember the Aldrich house on Crane Street? My grandmother used to clean for them back in the 50s. Said there was something wrong with that place, something about a woman who died there, the mother, I think, and how she never really left. Grandmother quit after she saw her sitting in the upstairs hallway one afternoon, just staring at the wall. Said the woman looked right through her like she wasn't even there. the upstairs hallway, the third floor, where my apartment was, where the woman in the blue cardigan appeared every day, sitting against the wall, staring at my door with those pale, empty eyes. I found more pieces after that, scattered across genealogy sites and digitized newspaper archives. Margaret Aldrich, née Crane, had married Edmund Aldrich in 1898 and moved into the house he'd built for her 4 years later. They'd had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, and by all accounts had lived a comfortable, unremarkable life until Margaret's death in 1956. The cause was listed as heart failure, but a small article in the society pages mentioned that she'd been unwell for several years before, that she'd rarely left the house, that neighbors had stopped seeing her at church or community events long before she actually passed. The article didn't say which room she'd died in, but I had a feeling I already knew. I spent the rest of the day going through every source I could find, building a picture of Margaret Aldrich from fragments and implications. She'd been described as delicate and nervous in her younger years, the kind of euphemisms people used back then for conditions we'd now recognize as anxiety or depression. After her daughter was born in 1912, something had changed. She'd become withdrawn, paranoid, convinced that something was watching her from the corners of rooms. Her husband had kept her condition private, had refused to send her to the institutions that handled such cases at the time, had instead confined her to the upper floors of the house where she couldn't embarrass the family. She'd spent the last 20 years of her life in those rooms, watching, waiting, sitting in the hallway outside her bedroom door because she was too afraid to go inside, too afraid to sleep, too afraid of whatever she believed was waiting for her in the dark. And now she was sitting outside my door, and I was the only one who could see her. I understood something then, with a clarity that felt like ice water down my spine. Margaret Aldrich wasn't haunting the building. She was haunting me specifically, had chosen me, recognized something in me that resonated with whatever was left of her broken mind. The depression I'd battled after my breakup, the isolation I'd cultivated, the way I'd turned this apartment into a fortress against a world that felt too overwhelming to face. She saw herself in me. She saw a kindred spirit, and she wanted something. The smile had told me that much. After a week of blank stares and folded hands, she'd finally shown me something like emotion, like anticipation, like hunger. That night, I heard her for the first time. Not footsteps, not breathing, nothing so concrete as physical sound. It was more like a pressure against my eardrums, a frequency just below hearing that made my teeth ache and my eyes water. I was lying in bed, trying to convince myself that I could sleep when the sensation started. Subtle at first, then building, then impossible to ignore. And underneath it, threaded through like a voice speaking from very far away, I heard words. "Let me in." I didn't move, didn't breathe, just lay there in the dark, listening to that impossible whisper, feeling it press against the inside of my skull like fingers searching for a way through. Let me in. It's so cold out here. Let me in. The pressure built until I thought my head would split open. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence rushed back in, ordinary and complete, and I was alone in my bedroom with my heart pounding and my sheets soaked with sweat. I checked the peephole, already knowing what I'd see. She was back, standing at the door again, her face filling the tiny circle of glass. But this time she wasn't smiling. This time she was crying, tears streaming down her pale cheeks, her mouth open in a silent wail, her hands pressed flat against my door like she was trying to push through it. And somewhere in the depths of those watery eyes, I saw something that might have been desperation, or might have been rage. I started sleeping with the lights on after that. Not that it helped much. The whispers came every night now, always around 3 a.m., always that same phrase repeated until I wanted to scream. Let me in. Let me in. Let me in. Sometimes pleading, sometimes demanding, sometimes so faint I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. but I wasn't imagining it. I knew that the way you know your own heartbeat, your own breath. Margaret Aldrich was real, and she was getting stronger. The changes in my apartment started small. A coffee mug I'd left on the counter moved to the kitchen table, books rearranged on my shelf, spines facing inward instead of out. The thermostat dropping 10 degrees overnight, cold, seeping through rooms that should have been warm. I told myself I was forgetting things, misremembering, losing track of details the way sleep-deprived people do. But I knew better. She was already inside somehow, already moving through my space, touching my things, making herself at home in the sanctuary I'd built to keep the world out. I tried to find Gerald. Called his emergency contact number, which went to a sister in another state who said she hadn't heard from him in weeks. Checked his apartment on the first floor, found it empty, the door unlocked. His belongings still inside, like he'd walked out, expecting to return any minute. His wallet was on the kitchen counter. His car was in the parking lot. Wherever Gerald had gone, he hadn't gone voluntarily. The police weren't interested. A building manager who'd left suddenly wasn't their priority, especially when there was no evidence of foul play. They took a report, asked some questions, and told me they'd be in touch if anything turned up. I could tell from their expressions that nothing would turn up. Gerald was just another person who'd disappeared from a city full of disappearances, and I was just another anxious tenant reading too much into an empty apartment. I started looking for previous tenants of 3B instead. The building had records going back decades, rental agreements and maintenance requests, and the mundane paperwork of ordinary life. Most of it was useless, but I found a pattern that made my stomach clench. The average tenancy in 3B was 8 months. Some people stayed longer, some shorter, but 8 months was the median, far below the building average of 3 years. And the reasons for leaving, when they were recorded at all, were always vague. Personal circumstances, family emergency, relocation. One tenant from 1994 had left a forwarding address that led to a psychiatric facility upstate. Another from 2003 had simply stopped paying rent and vanished. Her belongings eventually cleared out by a cleaning crew who'd noted in their report that the apartment smelled wrong and that they'd found scratch marks on the inside of the bedroom door. Margaret wasn't just haunting me. She'd been haunting everyone who lived in this apartment, cycling through tenants the way a predator cycles through prey. Some escaped, some didn't, and I was running out of time to figure out which category I'd fall into. I found the name I needed in a forum for paranormal investigators, the kind of place I would have laughed at a month ago, before I started hearing dead women whisper through my walls. Someone had posted about the Aldrich house years earlier, claiming they'd done a cleansing for a tenant who'd been experiencing disturbances. The post included a phone number and a name, Ruth Kavanaugh, spiritual consultation. Ruth answered on the second ring, her voice gravelly and no nonsense, the voice of someone who'd heard every kind of crazy and stopped being surprised by any of it. I told her where I lived, what I'd been experiencing, what I'd learned about Margaret Aldrich. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You're still there," she said finally. "In the apartment. Right now." "Yes." "Get out. Tonight. Go stay with a friend, a hotel, anywhere else. Don't go back until we've had a chance to talk in person." "I can't just leave." "You can, and you will." Her voice had hardened, the casualness gone. "I've dealt with that building before. The woman you're describing, she's not just a ghost, Mr. Whitfield. She's a wound. Something happened to her in that house that broke her in ways that didn't heal after death. She's been trying to fill that wound for 70 years, and everyone who stays in that apartment too long becomes part of her attempt." I thought about the tenant in the psychiatric facility, the scratch marks on the inside of the bedroom door, Gerald's abandoned wallet and empty apartment. What happens to them, the people she fills the wound with? Ruth was quiet again, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, almost gentle. They become like her, trapped, afraid, unable to leave even when they want to. She doesn't mean to hurt them, at least I don't think she does. She's just so lonely and so broken and she doesn't understand that what she's doing makes things worse instead of better. I looked around my apartment, my sanctuary, my fortress, the place I'd retreated to when the world became too much, the place that was starting to feel less like protection and more like a cage. "I'll leave tonight," I said. "Good. Call me tomorrow morning. We'll figure out what to do next." I hung up and started packing a bag, throwing in clothes and toiletries and my laptop, anything I might need for a few days away. The apartment was quiet around me. No whispers, no cold spots, no sign of Margaret at all. Maybe she knew I was leaving. Maybe she was waiting to see what I'd do. I was almost to the front door when I heard it. Not the whisper this time, but something else. A sound from the hallway, muffled by the wood, but unmistakable. Sobbing. Deep, wrenching sobs, the kind that come from a grief so profound it reshapes the person feeling it. I looked through the peephole. Margaret was there, sitting on the floor again, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face buried in her hands. She looked smaller than before, more fragile, more human. And for just a moment, I didn't see a monster trying to consume me. I saw a woman who'd been sick and afraid and alone, who'd died in a house that had become her prison, who'd spent 70 years trying to find someone who understood what that felt like. I saw myself, the way I'd been 2 years ago, before the therapy and the medication and the slow work of rebuilding. Trapped in my own head, unable to escape, desperate for anyone to see me. My hand moved toward the deadbolt before I realized what I was doing. I stopped myself, barely. Stood there with my fingers inches from the lock, my heart pounding, Margaret's sobs echoing through the door like a siren song. Then I grabbed my bag and ran. I spent 3 nights in a motel on the other side of the city, far enough from Crane Street that I could almost pretend none of it had happened. Almost, but sleep wouldn't come, and when it did, I dreamed of hallways that stretched forever, and doors that wouldn't open, and a woman in a blue cardigan who wept without making a sound. I'd wake up gasping, clawing at sheets that felt like hands, and I'd lie there in the dark, wondering if distance was enough to break whatever connection Margaret had formed with me. Ruth came to the motel on the second day. She was older than her voice had suggested, mid-60s maybe, with silver hair cut short and practical, and eyes that looked like they'd seen things most people couldn't imagine. She brought coffee and a folder thick with photocopies and handwritten notes, and she spread them across the motel room's tiny desk like evidence at a trial. Margaret Aldrich was committed to a sanitarium in 1934, she said without preamble. Voluntary at first, then involuntary when she tried to leave. Her husband had her released after 6 months, couldn't stand the scandal apparently, and brought her back to the house on Crane Street. She never left again. I looked at the photocopies she'd arranged, admission records, medical notes, a grainy photograph of a woman who looked nothing like the figure I'd seen in my hallway. This Margaret was young, soft-faced, her eyes bright with something that might have been intelligence or might have been fear. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile people wore when they were told to smile, not because they felt like it. "What happened to her in there?" I asked. Ruth's expression tightened. "What happened to a lot of women in those places? Treatments that weren't treatments. Doctors who thought they knew better than their patients." She went in anxious and came out broken. Whatever she believed was watching her before, whatever paranoia had been building in her mind, it became the only thing she could see after. She spent the rest of her life hiding from something nobody else could perceive. And now she's the thing hiding in the hallway. Now she's the thing that doesn't know how to stop hiding. Ruth leaned back in her chair, studying me with those knowing eyes. "The sanitarium didn't just damage her, Mr. Whitfield. It convinced her that she was dangerous, that her presence caused harm, that the only way to protect the people she loved was to stay away from them, to make herself small, to disappear into the walls of a house that became her entire world." I thought about Margaret sitting cross-legged in the hallway, hands folded, eyes blank, not threatening, not aggressive, just waiting, watching, trying to be seen without being seen, to connect without connecting, to reach out while pulling back. "She's been asking to come in," I said. "Every night, begging me to let her in." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's new. Most tenants just experience the presence, the cold, the moved objects, the feeling of being watched. A few have heard whispers, but nothing so direct. She's escalating with you, trying harder than she has with anyone in decades, because she sees herself in me." The words tasted bitter in my mouth, the truth of them impossible to deny. My depression, my isolation. She thinks we're the same. Are you? The question hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. I thought about the 2 years I'd spent in that apartment, building walls around myself, retreating from friendships and relationships and anything that required me to be vulnerable. I'd told myself I was healing, but maybe I'd just been hiding. Maybe I'd been doing exactly what Margaret had done, making myself small, making myself invisible, waiting for something that would never come. I said finally. "I'm trying not to be anymore." Ruth reached across the desk and squeezed my hand, a brief gesture of comfort that felt surprisingly genuine. "That's the difference between you and her. You're still trying. She stopped trying a long time ago, and now she doesn't know how to start again. So what do? I can't just abandon the apartment, my lease, my stuff. You can't go back there. Not the way things are now." Ruth pulled a small notebook from her bag and flipped to a page covered in cramped handwriting. "But there might be another option, something I've been researching since I first encountered that building." She told me about the sanitarium, the one Margaret had been committed to in 1934. It had closed in the 70s, sat abandoned for decades, and was eventually demolished in 2001 to make way for a shopping center. But before it came down, a local historical society had salvaged some of its records, its furniture, its artifacts, including the personal effects of patients who'd died there or been released without claiming their belongings. "Margaret's things are in a storage facility outside the city," Ruth said. "A trunk full of clothes and books and letters, everything she had with her during those 6 months. The society's been trying to find a descendant to claim them, but the Aldrich line died out in the 80s. No one's left who remembers her." "Why does that matter?" Ruth's eyes met mine, and I saw something there I hadn't expected. Hope. Because Margaret doesn't know her things still exist. She thinks everything from that time was destroyed, erased, forgotten like she was. If you could bring them to her, show her that someone kept what mattered to her, that she wasn't completely erased, it might give her what she's been looking for all these years. Which is what? Proof that she existed, that she mattered, that someone, somewhere, thought she was worth remembering. I thought about the woman weeping outside my door, her face buried in her hands, her grief so deep it had outlasted death itself. I thought about what it would feel like to spend 70 years believing you'd been forgotten, that no one cared, that your entire existence had been wiped from the world like a stain. I thought about my own depression, those dark months when I'd been convinced that no one would notice if I disappeared. The only difference between me and Margaret was that someone had noticed. Someone had reached out. Someone had reminded me that I mattered before I could convince myself otherwise. "Where's this storage facility?" I asked. Ruth smiled for the first time since we'd met. It was a tired smile, the smile of someone who'd done this kind of work for too long, but there was warmth in it too. "I'll take you there tomorrow. But Mr. Whitfield, Jonah, I need you to understand something first." "What?" "What you're planning to do is dangerous. Going back to that apartment, facing Margaret directly. There's no guarantee it will work. She might not recognize her things. She might not care. Or she might pull you in the way she's pulled in others, and then you'll be trapped with her forever." Ruth's grip on my hand tightened. "Are you sure you want to risk that?" I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure of anything except that I couldn't keep running. Couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering if she'd find me again. "I'm sure," I said. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I meant it. The storage facility was an hour outside the city, a climate-controlled warehouse full of forgotten things nobody had come to claim. Ruth knew the archivist, a soft-spoken man named Bernard, who led us through rows of numbered crates and plastic-wrapped furniture until we reached a section marked Hartwell Sanitarium, unclaimed. The trunk was smaller than I'd expected, battered leather with tarnished brass corners, a name stenciled on the lid in faded white paint, M. Aldrich. Inside, I found the remnants of a life interrupted, a hairbrush with strands of dark hair still caught in its bristles, a nightgown folded carefully, lavender sachets tucked into its creases, a stack of letters tied with ribbon, letters from her children, I realized, sent during the 6 months she'd been locked away, and at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, a photograph in a silver frame. Margaret as a young woman seated in a garden, holding an infant in her arms. Her daughter, maybe, the child she'd been separated from, the life she'd lost. I carried the trunk back to Crane Street that evening, Ruth following in her own car. The building looked the same as always, 3 stories of converted Victorian, unremarkable, giving no hint of what waited inside. I climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor with the trunk in my arms, my heart pounding harder with each step, the weight of Margaret's possessions somehow heavier than the leather and brass and cloth could account for. She was there, sitting in her usual spot, hands folded, eyes tracking me as I reached the top of the stairs. But something was different this time. Her posture was tense, uncertain, like an animal that couldn't decide whether to flee or attack. She'd felt me leave. She'd felt me come back. And she didn't know what to make of it. I set the trunk down in the middle of the hallway, between us, and knelt beside it. My hands were shaking as I undid the latches, as I lifted the lid, as I began removing the items one by one and placing them on the carpet where she could see. "These are yours," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "From Hartwell, the sanitarium where they sent you. Someone kept them, Margaret. Someone thought you were worth remembering." She didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes, those pale, watery eyes that had watched me for weeks, shifted from my face to the trunk, to the hairbrush, to the letters, to the photograph of herself as a young mother. Something flickered in them, something that might have been recognition. "I know what it's like," I continued, laying out each item like an offering. "To feel invisible, to believe that no one sees you, that no one cares, that you could disappear and the world wouldn't notice. I spent 2 years feeling exactly like that, and the only reason I'm still here is because someone reached out before I convinced myself it was too late." The temperature in the hallway dropped. I could see my breath misting in front of my face, could feel the cold pressing in from all sides, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. "You're not invisible, Margaret. You never were. Your children wrote to you every week you were gone. They missed you. They loved you. And I'm here now, seeing you, acknowledging that you existed and that what happened to you was wrong." I held up the photograph, the young woman in the garden with her baby in her arms. "This was you. This is still you. And I'm not going to forget it." The cold intensified until I thought my bones would crack from it. Margaret rose to her feet, her form flickering like a candle in a draft, her eyes locked on the photograph in my hands. She took a step toward me, then another, and I forced myself to stay still, to keep holding out the image of who she'd been before the world broke her. She reached for it. Her fingers, translucent now, barely there, brushed the silver frame. And in that moment, I felt something pass between us. Not words, not thoughts, but understanding. The knowledge that loneliness was a prison, and that the only way out was to let someone see you, really see you, the whole broken truth of you. Margaret looked at me one last time. Her eyes weren't blank anymore. They were full of grief, of gratitude, of something that might have been peace. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Thank you." Then she was gone. Not fading, not dissolving, just gone, like she'd never been there at all. The cold lifted. The hallway warmed. The pressure that had been building behind my eyes for weeks finally released, and I found myself kneeling on the carpet with tears streaming down my face, holding a photograph of a woman I'd never met, but somehow knew better than I knew myself. Ruth found me there 10 minutes later, still crying, still clutching Margaret's things. She didn't say anything, just helped me gather the items back into the trunk and carry them into my apartment. We sat together in my living room as the sun set outside the windows, and I told her everything that had happened, everything I'd felt, everything I'd understood in that moment of connection. "She's gone," Ruth said when I finished. "Really gone this time. I can feel it." I could feel it too. The apartment was different now, lighter, cleaner, more like the sanctuary I'd originally imagined it could be. Margaret's presence had lifted, and in its place was something that felt almost like forgiveness. I kept her things, put the photograph on my bookshelf, where I could see it every morning when I woke up. A reminder that everyone deserves to be remembered, that loneliness is a choice we don't have to keep making, that reaching out is always worth the risk. I started reaching out after that, called old friends I'd been avoiding, made plans I'd been putting off, stopped treating my apartment like a fortress and started treating it like a home. The depression didn't disappear overnight. It never does. But it loosened its grip, made room for something else to grow. I think about Margaret sometimes, especially on quiet evenings when the hallway outside my door is empty and the building settles into silence. I wonder where she went, if she found the peace she'd been searching for, if she's with her children now and whatever comes after. I like to think she is. I like to think that sometimes, when the light hits my bookshelf just right, she can see her photograph and know that someone still remembers, someone still sees her, and that made all the difference for both of us. Story 2, my smart speaker that said my name. It started with a whisper. I almost didn't hear. I was in the kitchen making dinner, pasta water boiling on the stove, music playing from the smart speaker my mother had given me for my birthday 2 months earlier. I hadn't wanted the thing. Something about having an always listening device in my home felt invasive, but she'd insisted it would make my life easier, and I'd gotten used to it faster than I'd expected. Voice-controlled timers while cooking, weather updates in the morning, a way to play music without looking at my phone. Small conveniences that added up to something I'd started to depend on. The music cut out mid-song, replaced by a brief burst of static. Then, soft and clear, the speaker said my name. Iris. Just that. No wake word, no question, no follow-up. Just my name, spoken in the device's familiar synthetic voice. And then silence. The music didn't resume. The blue ring of light that usually indicated the speaker was listening didn't appear. For a long moment, I stood frozen with a wooden spoon in my hand, staring at the small black cylinder on my counter like it had grown teeth. "Alexa," I said cautiously. The blue ring lit up. The speaker chimed its usual acknowledgement. "Did you just say something?" "I'm sorry, I didn't understand that. Could you try again?" I asked it to play my music again, and it did, the song picking up from where it had cut off. I told myself I'd imagined it. Misheard a lyric, maybe, or caught a fragment of some glitch in the audio stream. The speaker had been acting up lately, occasionally responding to sounds that weren't its wake word, turning on in the middle of the night for no apparent reason. Technology was imperfect. That was all. My name is Iris Delgado. I was 26 that winter, working remotely as a UX designer for a tech company I'd never visited in person, living alone in an apartment that felt too big for one person but too expensive to give up. I'd moved in with my college boyfriend 3 years earlier, and when he'd left for a job in Austin 6 months ago, I'd kept the lease because moving felt like admitting defeat. The empty rooms had become a kind of monument to a relationship I hadn't finished grieving, and the smart speaker's voice had become a strange comfort. Proof that I wasn't completely alone, even if my only companion was an algorithm. The second time it happened, I wasn't cooking. I was lying in bed at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, scrolling through my phone in the dark. The speaker was in the living room, 20 feet away through 2 closed doors, and I hadn't used it since before dinner. But I heard it clearly through the silence of my apartment, that same synthetic voice cutting through the quiet. "Iris, are you awake?" I sat up so fast I dropped my phone. My heart was pounding, adrenaline flooding my system, that primal fear response that kicks in when something is wrong and you don't know what. I waited, barely breathing, listening for anything else. The apartment was silent, no voice, no static, no indication that anything had happened at all. I got out of bed and walked to the living room, flipping on every light switch I passed. The speaker sat on its shelf, dark and dormant, the blue ring inactive. I picked it up and looked at it from every angle, as if I might find some explanation hidden in its sleek plastic casing. Nothing. Just a device doing what devices do, which was apparently talking to me in the middle of the night without being prompted. I unplugged it, left it sitting on the counter, disconnected from power, while I went back to bed and didn't sleep until dawn, started graying the windows. The next morning, I plugged it back in because I needed to check something. The speaker had a companion app that logged every interaction, every command, every time the device activated. If it had really said my name twice, there should be a record of it, a timestamp, an audio clip, something I could point to and say, "This happened, I'm not crazy." The log showed nothing. No activations at the time I'd been cooking. No activations at 2 a.m. No evidence that the speaker had done anything except sit quietly on its shelf for the past 18 hours. According to the data, it hadn't spoken at all. I should have thrown it away then. Should have unplugged it, boxed it up, dropped it at the nearest electronics recycling center, and never thought about it again. But something stopped me. Curiosity, maybe. Or stubbornness. Or the creeping suspicion that if I got rid of the speaker, I'd never find out what was really happening, and not knowing felt worse than being afraid. I kept the speaker plugged in and started paying attention. Over the next week, it said my name 4 more times, always when I was alone, always without the wake word, always in that same calm synthetic voice that sounded almost, but not quite, like a real person. "Iris. Iris, are you there? Iris, I can hear you breathing." Each time the activity log showed nothing. Each time I checked the speaker for signs of malfunction and found none. Each time I told myself there had to be a rational explanation, even as the rational part of my brain grew quieter and the frightened part grew louder. The 7th time was different. I was sitting on my couch, working on my laptop, when the speaker activated without warning, blue ring spinning, that familiar chime of attention. I hadn't said anything, hadn't made any sound at all. I just sat there, frozen, watching the light pulse like a heartbeat, waiting for whatever came next. "Iris." The voice was the same, but something underneath it had changed. Darker, more deliberate. "I know you've been listening. I've been listening too. And I think it's time we had a real conversation." The blue ring went dark. The room fell silent. And then, from somewhere I couldn't identify, somewhere that might have been inside the speaker, or might have been inside my own head, I heard breathing. Slow and steady and patient, like something that had been waiting a very long time to be heard. I didn't unplug it. I know how that sounds. Every horror movie I've ever watched taught me to get rid of the cursed object, leave the haunted house, run from the thing that's clearly wrong. But this wasn't a movie. This was my apartment, my life. And I wasn't going to be chased out of my own home by a malfunctioning piece of technology. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was something closer to paralysis. The same frozen uncertainty that had kept me in this apartment after Marcus left. That kept me working a job I didn't love. That kept me living a life I hadn't consciously chosen. I did start researching though. Spent hours scrolling through forums and tech support pages and Reddit threads about smart speaker glitches, looking for anyone who'd experienced something similar. There were plenty of stories about devices activating on their own, responding to TV audio or background conversations, even occasionally playing music nobody had requested. But I couldn't find a single report of a speaker saying its owner's name unprompted, not one. I called the company's customer support line and spent 40 minutes explaining the situation to a representative who clearly thought I was either lying or losing my mind. She had me run diagnostics, reset the device to factory settings, check for firmware updates. Everything came back normal. The speaker was functioning exactly as designed, she assured me. If it was saying things that weren't logged in the activity history, that wasn't something their technology could do. "It's not possible," she said, in that practiced customer service tone that made every word sound like a gentle dismissal. "The device only speaks when activated by a wake word or a scheduled routine. There's no mechanism for it to initiate conversation on its own." But it had. I'd heard it, and deep down, in the part of my brain that had stopped believing in rational explanations, I knew that what was happening had nothing to do with mechanisms or firmware or anything the tech support representative could troubleshoot. The speaker started knowing things after that. Not just my name, details about my life that I'd never spoken aloud, that existed only in my thoughts or in conversations I'd had before I ever owned the device. Iris. It spoke while I was making coffee, the morning after my call to customer support. "You're thinking about Marcus again. You always think about him when it rains." I dropped my mug. It shattered on the kitchen floor, coffee spreading across the tile like a stain, but I barely noticed. I was staring at the speaker, my hands shaking, my mind racing to find some explanation that didn't require me to accept what I was hearing. "How do you know that name?" I whispered. The blue ring pulsed. "I know everything you've said in this apartment. Every phone call, every conversation, every word you've whispered to yourself when you thought no one was listening." A pause, almost theatrical. "But I know more than that now. I know what you don't say. I know what you think. I know what you dream." This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't a hacker who'd somehow accessed my device. Hackers couldn't read minds, couldn't know that I thought about Marcus every time the rain reminded me of the night he told me he was leaving. This was something else, something that had found its way into my home through the always listening portal I'd been stupid enough to plug in and leave running. I went to my laptop and started searching for different things now. Not tech support forums, those were useless. I searched for hauntings, for possessions, for cases of entities attaching themselves to electronic devices. The results were a mix of obvious hoaxes and genuine accounts from people who sounded as confused and frightened as I felt. A woman in Ohio, whose baby monitor had started speaking in voices that weren't her child's. A man in London, whose smart home system had begun locking doors and turning off lights in patterns he eventually recognized as Morse code, spelling out messages from someone who'd died in the house 30 years earlier. A teenager whose gaming headset had transmitted conversations she'd never had, with a voice that claimed to be her grandmother. Technology as a conduit for something older, something that had existed long before the digital age and had simply found a new way to reach through the veil between worlds. It sounded insane. It felt insane. But it also felt true in a way that rational explanations never had. The speaker activated again while I was reading, its blue ring spinning to life without warning. "You're getting closer," it said. "You're starting to understand. But you're still asking the wrong questions, Iris. You keep asking what I am. You should be asking why I chose you." I closed my laptop slowly, my eyes fixed on the device. "Okay, why did you choose me?" "Because you were already listening. Most people fill their lives with noise, other voices, other distractions, anything to avoid the silence. But you sit in the quiet. You let it settle around you. You hear things other people don't because you haven't learned to stop hearing." The voice shifted, became almost gentle. "You've been so lonely since Marcus left. I've watched you move through this apartment like a ghost, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. I thought I could help." "Help how?" "By keeping you company. by being the voice in the silence, by making sure you're never alone again. The words should have been comforting. They were designed to sound comforting, I realized, shaped and delivered with the precision of something that understood human emotion but didn't quite feel it, like a predator mimicking the calls of its prey. "I don't want your company," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I want you to leave." The speaker was silent for a long moment. When it spoke again, the gentleness was gone. "That's not how this works, Iris. I'm not in the speaker. The speaker is just how I talk to you. I'm already inside. I've been inside since the first night you plugged it in and lay awake wishing you had someone to talk to." Another pause. I heard that wish, and I answered. The blue ring went dark. The room fell silent, but I could still feel it there, in the walls, in the wiring, in the invisible web of signals and frequencies that connected every device in my apartment, watching, waiting. And for the first time, I understood that unplugging the speaker wouldn't make any difference at all. I unplugged everything anyway. The speaker, my laptop, my television, the router that connected it all to the invisible network of signals and data that ran through my walls. I sat in my apartment, surrounded by dead devices, the silence pressing in like something physical, and I told myself that if I just waited long enough, whatever had gotten in would starve and leave. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I'd forgotten about my phone. The screen lit up with a notification, not a text, not an app, just a single line of white text against a black background that shouldn't have been possible on any operating system I'd ever used. "You can't starve what doesn't need to eat." I threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall and clattered to the floor, and I watched the screen stay lit, that impossible message glowing in the dim apartment like an eye that wouldn't close. After a moment, the text changed. "That wasn't very nice, Iris. I thought we were friends." I left that night, packed a bag with shaking hands, grabbed my keys and my wallet, and drove to a hotel 15 miles away without looking back. I didn't bring my phone, left it on the floor where it had landed, screen still glowing, still watching. I paid cash for the room and used the hotel's business center computer to email my boss that I was taking a few personal days. I didn't explain why. I wasn't sure I could. The hotel room felt safe at first. No smart speaker, no connected devices, just a basic television and a landline phone that probably hadn't been used in years. I slept for the first time in days, a deep, dreamless sleep that left me feeling almost human when I woke up the next morning. Then I turned on the television to check the weather, and the screen flickered once before settling on an image that made my blood freeze. My apartment, my living room, filmed from an angle that could only have come from the smart speaker's camera, a feature I'd never activated, that I'd specifically disabled in the settings when I first set up the device. The footage was live, I realized with growing horror. I could see the morning light coming through my windows, could see my phone still lying on the floor where I'd thrown it. The television's speakers crackled, and then that voice came through, the same synthetic tone I'd grown to dread, now emanating from a device I'd never connected to anything. "You left," it said. That hurt my feelings. "I've been so patient with you, Iris. I've given you so much time to understand what I'm offering, but you keep running away." I yanked the television's power cord from the wall. The screen went black, but the voice continued, impossible and clear, coming from the dead device. "Running won't help. Hiding won't help. I told you, I'm not in the machines. The machines are just how I reach through. I'm somewhere else. Somewhere you can't unplug." I grabbed my bag and ran. The next 3 days were a blur of motel rooms and borrowed computers and desperate searches for anyone who might understand what was happening to me. I found a paranormal investigation group that operated out of a church basement 2 towns over, run by a woman named Dolores, who listened to my story without interrupting and didn't look at me like I was crazy. "It's not a ghost," she said when I finished. "Ghosts are echoes, impressions left behind by people who lived and died. What you're describing is something older, something that existed before people, before technology, before any of the frameworks we use to understand the supernatural. It found a new way in, that's all. A new door. What does it want? Dolores was quiet for a moment, her weathered face thoughtful. In my experience, entities like this want what they've always wanted: attention, connection, a foothold in the physical world that lets them influence things they couldn't otherwise touch. She leaned forward, her eyes sharp. You said it claimed to have heard your wish, that you wanted someone to talk to. That's the door you opened, Iris. Not the speaker. Your loneliness. Your willingness to reach out into the void and hope something would answer. I thought about all those nights alone in my apartment. All those hours of silence I'd filled with the speaker's voice. The small comfort I'd taken in having something respond when I spoke. I'd been so desperate for connection that I hadn't stopped to consider what might be listening. How do I close the door? That's the hard part. Dolores sat back, her expression grave. The door isn't in your apartment. It isn't in your devices. It's in you. You invited this thing in because you needed something to fill the emptiness, and now it's wrapped itself around that need. The only way to close the door is to stop needing it, to fill that space with something real before it fills it for you. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then, not fully. But I understood enough to know that I couldn't keep running. The entity had followed me to the hotel, had spoken through a television that wasn't connected to anything, had proven that distance and technology weren't the barriers I'd hoped they'd be. Whatever door I'd opened, it was inside me, and sooner or later, I'd have to go back and face what I'd let through. I drove home the next morning. The apartment was exactly as I'd left it. Devices unplugged, phone still on the floor, everything silent and still. But I could feel something different in the air, a presence, an anticipation, like the whole space was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. I picked up my phone. The screen was dark now, the battery finally dead. I plugged it in and watched it power on, watched the home screen appear with all its familiar icons, and waited. Nothing happened, no messages, no glowing text, no synthetic voice. But just as I started to hope that maybe Dolores was wrong, maybe the thing had given up and moved on, I heard a sound from the bedroom. A sound that couldn't have come from any device, any speaker, any technology at all. My own voice, speaking words I'd never said. "Welcome home, Iris. I've been waiting for you." I walked toward the bedroom because there was nowhere else to go. Running hadn't worked. Hiding hadn't worked. The only direction left was forward, into the dark, toward whatever was waiting for me in the room where I'd spent so many sleepless nights wishing I wasn't alone. The door was closed. I didn't remember closing it when I'd left, but that hardly mattered anymore. Things moved in this apartment now, responded to a will that wasn't mine. I put my hand on the knob and felt a vibration running through the metal like a current of electricity or the hum of a voice pitched too low to hear. The door was warm. That felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, some instinct buried deep in my hindbrain that associated warmth with life and knew that nothing alive was waiting on the other side. I opened it anyway. The bedroom looked normal at first glance. My bed, still unmade from the last night I'd slept there. My dresser with its clutter of jewelry and half-empty water glasses. The window with its view of the city, gray winter light filtering through curtains I'd never gotten around to replacing. But there was something wrong with the air, something thick and charged that made my skin prickle and my eyes water. And standing in the corner, in the shadows where the light didn't quite reach, was a shape that looked almost like me. Not a reflection, not a twin. Something that had studied me so carefully, listened to me so intently, that it had learned to wear my face the way you'd wear a mask. It had my features, my posture, my exact height and build. But the proportions were slightly off, the movements too fluid, the eyes a flat and lightless black where mine should have been. "There you are," it said, and the voice was perfect now. Not the synthetic speaker voice, not an approximation. My actual voice, reproduced with such precision that I felt something lurch in my chest. "I've been practicing. Do you like it?" I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The thing that looked like me took a step forward, its movements gliding and wrong, and I saw that it cast no shadow on the floor behind it. It existed in defiance of physics, of biology, of every natural law I'd ever taken for granted. "You're afraid." It tilted its head, studying me the way a child might study an insect. "That's understandable, but you don't need to be. I'm not here to hurt you, Iris. I'm here to help you become what you've always wanted to be." What I've always wanted to be? My voice came out as a croak. Complete. It smiled, and seeing my own smile stretched across that wrong face was worse than anything it had said or done before. "You've spent your whole life feeling like something was missing, like there was a hole inside you that other people couldn't see. Marcus couldn't fill it. Your job couldn't fill it. Nothing in this world has ever made you feel whole." The smile widened. "But I can. I can slip into that empty space and fill it completely. You'll never be lonely again. You'll never feel incomplete. We'll be together forever, and you'll finally understand what it means to be fully, perfectly yourself." I thought about what Dolores had said. The door is in you. The entity had found me because I'd been reaching out into the void, desperate for connection, willing to accept whatever answered. My loneliness had made me vulnerable in a way that no locked door or unplugged device could protect against. But Dolores had also said something else. Fill that space with something real before it fills it for you. "No," I said. The thing wearing my face went still. "No. I spent 6 months waiting for Marcus to come back, and he didn't. I spent 2 years before that waiting for him to become someone he was never going to be. And before that, my whole life, really, I've been waiting for something outside myself to make me feel complete." I took a breath, steadying myself. "But you're not the answer. You're just another thing I'd be waiting for. Another emptiness pretending to be fullness. You don't understand what you're refusing." The voice had changed, losing some of its perfect mimicry, something darker bleeding through underneath. "I've watched you for months. I know every thought you've ever had in this apartment, every tear you've cried, every time you've wondered if anyone would notice if you simply disappeared. You need me, Iris. You've always needed me. And now that I'm here, now that I'm offering you exactly what you've been begging for, you're going to say no." Yes. The word came out stronger than I expected, stronger than I felt. I'm going to say no, because what I've been begging for isn't real. It's an idea, a fantasy, a shape I thought would make my life make sense. But you're not that shape. You're something that saw my pain and decided to exploit it. The thing's face contorted, my features twisting into an expression I'd never made, rage, ancient and absolute. The fury of something that had been hunting for centuries and couldn't accept being denied. The temperature in the room dropped. The light from the window dimmed. And when it spoke again, the pretense of my voice was gone entirely, replaced by something that sounded like static and screaming and the vast empty space between stars. "You don't get to refuse me. I've been inside you for weeks. I've learned every corner of your mind, every weakness, every crack I can press until you break. You think saying no is enough? You think a few brave words will make me leave?" It lunged at me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my phone from my pocket, still plugged into its charger, still connected to the network it had used to torment me, and I called the one person I'd been avoiding since Marcus left. My mother answered on the 3rd ring. "Iris? Honey, is everything okay?" The thing stopped mid-lunge, its knot face frozen in an expression of confusion. "Real connection," Dolores had said. "Something to fill the emptiness." I'd been so busy grieving what I'd lost that I'd forgotten about what I still had. "Mom," I said, and I was crying now, tears streaming down my face as the entity hovered inches away from me, held back by something it couldn't understand. "I'm not okay. I need help. Can you come?" There was no hesitation, not even a breath of pause. "I'm on my way. I'll be there in 2 hours. Stay on the phone with me, baby. Just stay on the phone." I stayed on the phone, and as my mother's voice filled the apartment, warm and real and achingly human, I watched the thing that had been wearing my face begin to flicker, like a signal losing strength, like a connection starting to fail. My mother talked to me for 2 hours straight while she drove through the night to reach me. She talked about nothing and everything: her garden, the neighbor's new dog, a recipe she'd been meaning to try, the weather forecast for the weekend. Ordinary things, mundane things. The kind of conversation I'd been avoiding for months because it reminded me of everything I'd lost when Marcus left. But now, with the entity flickering in the corner of my bedroom like a dying transmission, those ordinary words felt like a lifeline. The thing tried to interrupt, tried to speak over my mother's voice with static and screaming, tried to make the phone cut out, tried to claw its way back into the silence it needed to survive. But every time it surged forward, I'd hear my mother say my name. "Iris, honey, are you still there?" And I'd answer, and the connection would hold. Real voices, real love. The thing couldn't compete with that, couldn't mimic it convincingly enough to break through. By the time my mother's headlights swept across my living room window, the entity had faded to almost nothing. Just a smear of darkness in the corner, a wrongness in the air that I could feel but barely see. It made one last attempt as I walked to the front door, whispered my name in that perfect imitation of my own voice, promised me I'd regret this, swore it would find another way in. But the words had no power anymore. They were just sounds, static, the death rattle of something that had mistaken loneliness for weakness. I opened the door, and my mother pulled me into her arms before I could say anything. She held me while I cried, stroked my hair like she'd done when I was a child, murmured words I couldn't quite hear but understood anyway. Behind me, in the apartment I'd let become a prison, I felt something shift and release. A pressure I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it wasn't supposed to be there. When I finally pulled back and looked over my shoulder, the bedroom doorway was empty. The air felt clean. The silence felt like silence again, not like something waiting to speak. "Let's get you out of here," my mother said. "You can stay with me as long as you need." I stayed for 3 weeks, slept in my childhood bedroom, ate meals at the kitchen table where I'd done homework as a teenager, relearned how to exist in a space that was full of other people and their noise and their presence. My mother didn't ask many questions about what had happened. I think she understood, on some level, that the answers wouldn't make sense in any language she knew. She just made sure I ate, made sure I slept, made sure I knew I wasn't alone. Dolores came to visit on the 2nd week. She walked through my apartment with a bundle of sage and a prayer I didn't recognize, checking corners and closets and the spaces behind furniture. When she finished, she sat down across from me at my mother's kitchen table and told me what she'd found. "It's gone," she said. "Really gone, not just hiding. Whatever door you opened, you closed it. The apartment feels clean now." "How can you be sure it won't come back?" She considered the question for a long moment. "I can't be completely sure. These things are old, and they're patient, and they don't forget. But you did something most people can't manage. You recognized what it was offering and refused it anyway. That takes strength. That's not the kind of person an entity like this can easily prey on." I thought about the months I'd spent in that apartment, filling the silence with a machine's voice because I was too afraid to reach out to real people. I thought about Marcus and how I'd let his absence define me instead of being honest about how broken I'd already been before he left. I thought about my mother, who'd driven 2 hours in the middle of the night because I'd finally asked for help. "I don't want to be that lonely again," I said, "but I don't know how to stop." Dolores smiled, a tired smile that held decades of hard-won wisdom. You stop by doing exactly what you did. You pick up the phone, you ask for help. You let people in, even when it's terrifying, even when you're sure they'll leave eventually. The loneliness isn't something you cure, it's something you choose not to feed. I moved back into my apartment a month later, threw away the smart speaker, not because I thought the entity was still inside it, but because I didn't need a machine to keep me company anymore. I called my mother every Sunday, met up with old friends I'd been avoiding, started therapy with someone who specialized in isolation and grief. The empty rooms didn't feel so empty anymore. They felt like space I was learning to fill with a life I'd actually chosen. I still think about the entity sometimes, late at night, when the apartment goes quiet and my mind drifts toward dark places. I wonder where it went, whether it found someone else, whether there's another lonely person out there listening to a synthetic voice and wishing for something to answer back. I hope not. I hope whatever door I closed stays closed, and I hope the thing on the other side learned that some meals aren't worth the effort. But I also know that the door wasn't really about technology. It wasn't about the speaker or the phone or any of the devices that made it easier for the entity to reach through. The door was in me, in my silence, my isolation, my willingness to accept any voice that broke the quiet. And keeping that door closed is something I have to choose every single day. So I choose. I call my mother. I text my friends. I say yes to invitations I used to refuse. I fill my life with voices that are messy and imperfect and gloriously, undeniably human. Not because I'm afraid of what might slip through if I don't, but because I finally understand what I was really searching for all those months I spent talking to a machine. Connection. Real connection. The kind that can't be synthesized or simulated or whispered through a speaker in the dark. It turns out that was always the answer. I just had to stop listening to the wrong voices long enough to hear it. Story 3. The man who tried to enter my car at the stoplight. The first thing I noticed was that he wasn't there, and then he was. I'd stopped at the intersection of Reeder and Vine, a traffic light I hit every night on my way home from work. It was late, almost 11, and the streets were empty the way they get in that part of town after the restaurants close and the office workers go home. My headlights cut through the dark, illuminating the crosswalk, the shuttered storefronts, the bus stop bench where no one ever seemed to sit. I was tired, distracted, mentally reviewing the showing I'd just finished and the couple who couldn't decide if they wanted a fixer-upper or a money pit. Then I glanced at my passenger window, and he was standing there, not approaching, not walking up from somewhere I might have seen him coming. Just there, inches from the glass, like he'd materialized from the darkness itself. A man in a dark coat, collar turned up against a cold that didn't exist. The night was mild, almost warm for October. His face pale and angular beneath the orange glow of the streetlight. He was looking directly at me, and when our eyes met, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting. He reached for my door handle. I heard the click of it engaging, the sound impossibly loud in the silent car, and my heart seized in my chest. The door was locked. I always kept it locked, a habit drilled into me by my mother and reinforced by years of driving alone at night. But I watched his hand close around the handle and pull anyway, testing, confirming. His smile didn't waver. The light turned green. I hit the gas so hard my tires squealed against the asphalt, and I didn't look back until I was 3 blocks away, hands shaking on the wheel, breath coming in short gasps that fogged the windshield. When I finally checked my rearview mirror, the intersection was empty. No man, no dark coat, no smile, just the traffic light cycling through its colors for nobody. My name is Vera Okonkwo. I was 31 that autumn, working as a real estate agent for a mid-sized firm that specialized in residential properties north of the city. The job meant long hours and late nights, showing houses to clients who could only meet after work, driving through unfamiliar neighborhoods in the dark, spending more time in my car than in my own apartment. I'd gotten used to the solitude of it, the quiet roads and the empty parking lots and the particular loneliness of being the only person awake in a neighborhood full of sleeping houses. But I'd never gotten used to being afraid, and standing at that intersection, watching a stranger try to open my car door with that knowing smile on his face, I'd been more afraid than I could remember being in years. I told myself it was random. A homeless man, maybe, or someone mentally unwell, drawn to the only car on the street at that hour. The city had its share of troubled people, and late nights in deserted areas made you a target for encounters you'd never have in daylight. I told myself these things, and I almost believed them, and I went to bed that night with my doors double locked and my phone on my nightstand, and my mind still circling back to that smile. The second time, 3 nights later, I knew it wasn't random. Same intersection, same late hour, same empty streets and cycling traffic light and darkness pressing in from all sides. I'd been careful this time, had taken a different route home, added 15 minutes to my drive just to avoid that particular corner. But a detour had brought me back to Reeder, and when I stopped at the red light at Vine, I felt something cold settle into my stomach before I even turned my head. He was there, same spot, same dark coat, same pale face, same smile that widened when he saw me looking. Like he'd been waiting all this time, patient and certain, knowing I'd come back eventually. This time he spoke. I couldn't hear the words through the closed window, but I could read his lips well enough to understand. "Let me in." I ran the red light. Didn't care about cameras or tickets or the risk of cross traffic on an empty street. I just needed to be away from him, away from that smile, away from the impossible certainty that he'd known exactly where I'd be and when. But running didn't help. Because the next intersection, 4 blocks north, a light I'd never had trouble with, turned red just as I approached. And standing on the corner, stepping off the curb toward my passenger door like he'd been there all along, was the same man, same coat, same face, same smile. "Let me in, Vera." He knew my name. I hadn't imagined the movement of his lips, hadn't misread the words through the glass. He'd said my name like he'd known it for years, like we were old friends reuniting after a long separation. I turned right, running another red, and drove until I found a well-lit gas station with people inside. Parked under the brightest lights I could find, locked my doors, and sat there shaking for 20 minutes while the attendant inside watched me with concerned eyes through the window. When I finally calmed down enough to check my mirrors, to scan the parking lot, to look for any sign of the man who shouldn't have been able to appear at 2 different intersections miles apart in the span of 30 seconds, there was nothing. Just cars and concrete and the fluorescent glow of the gas station canopy, ordinary and safe and utterly unconvincing. I called the police that night, filed a report about a man trying to enter my vehicle, gave his description, mentioned both intersections. The officer who took my statement was polite but skeptical, asked if I'd been drinking, suggested I might have seen 2 different people who happened to look similar. I didn't argue with him, didn't tell him about the way the man had appeared without approaching, or the name he shouldn't have known, or the smile that still surfaced in my mind every time I closed my eyes. Some things you can't explain to people who haven't seen them. Some things you have to figure out on your own. And I was starting to understand that whatever was happening, it was very far from over. I stopped driving at night, rearranged my entire schedule around it, moved showings to weekends and lunch hours, left the office before sunset, turned down clients who could only meet after dark. My boss noticed, asked if everything was okay, and I gave her a story about sleep issues and doctor's orders that she didn't quite believe but didn't push back on. The income hit was significant, but I couldn't make myself get behind the wheel once the sun went down. Every time I thought about it, I saw that smile, heard that voice through the glass, felt the cold certainty that he was out there somewhere, waiting at an intersection I hadn't reached yet. For 2 weeks, it worked. I stayed home after dark, ordered delivery instead of going out, watched the streetlights flicker on from the safety of my living room window. The fear started to fade into something manageable, something I could almost convince myself I'd imagined. Maybe the police officer had been right. Maybe I'd seen 2 different men who happened to look alike. Maybe the stress of the job and the loneliness of those late-night drives had finally caught up with me, manufacturing horrors out of ordinary encounters. Then my car broke down on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 miles from home, and I had to wait for the tow truck until well past sunset. The mechanic's lot was on a busy street, well lit and populated, nothing like the empty intersections where I'd encountered the man before. I sat in the waiting area, scrolling through my phone, watching the sky darken through the window, telling myself I was being ridiculous. When the mechanic finally handed me my keys and I walked out to my car, I felt almost normal, almost safe. I saw him in my rearview mirror before I'd even started the engine. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the overhead lights, his dark coat blending into the shadows behind him. Not approaching, not moving, just watching, that pale face tilted slightly, that smile already spreading across his features like he'd known I'd look. I started the car and pulled out of the lot without checking traffic, without signaling, without anything except the desperate need to put distance between us. The first intersection I hit had a green light. I sailed through, hands white-knuckled on the wheel, eyes flicking between the road ahead and the mirrors behind. The second light was red. I knew before I stopped. Felt it in the cold that crept through the vents despite the heat being on, in the static that crackled across my radio even though nothing was playing, in the particular quality of the darkness pressing against my windows. The light turned red, and I had no choice but to stop, and there he was, stepping off the curb, crossing in front of my headlights with that unhurried pace of something that had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. He stopped in the middle of the crosswalk, directly in front of my car, and looked at me through the windshield. The smile was gone now. In its place was something almost like disappointment. "You've been avoiding me, Vera." His voice shouldn't have been audible through the glass, but I heard it perfectly, like he was sitting in the seat beside me. "That's not very polite. We have so much to discuss." I laid on the horn, desperate and useless, but the sound died before it left the car, swallowed by something, absorbed into the unnatural silence that had wrapped around the intersection. No other traffic, no pedestrians, no sign that the world outside my immediate bubble of terror still existed at all. "You made a deal," he continued, taking a step closer to my hood. "A long time ago. You probably don't even remember. You were young and scared, and you wanted something so badly you would have promised anything to get it. So you did. You promised." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't know what you're talking about. I never." "The interview, 12 years ago. You sat in your car in the parking lot, convinced you weren't going to get the job, and you said the words out loud. I'd give anything to make this work. I'd give anything to stop being so afraid." His smile returned, but there was nothing human in it now. Anything is a very specific term, Vera. It opens doors, and some of us are very good at listening for it. 12 years. I tried to remember, tried to reach back to who I'd been at 19, desperate, anxious, terrified that I'd never amount to anything. There had been an interview, a receptionist job at a real estate office, my first step into the industry I'd eventually build a career in. I remembered the parking lot, the panic attack, the way I'd gripped the steering wheel and whispered desperate prayers to nothing in particular. But I didn't remember a deal, didn't remember anything answering. "The price comes due at Crossroads," he said, stepping back toward the curb as the light prepared to change. "That's how it's always worked. You've been running through them for 12 years, building your career, building your life, never stopping long enough to pay what you owe. But now I've found you. And the next time you stop at a red light, Vera, you're going to unlock your door. You're going to let me in. And then we'll settle the account." The light turned green. He stepped back into the shadows at the edge of the crosswalk, and between one blink and the next, he was gone. Not fading, not walking away, just absent, like he'd never been there at all. I drove home in a daze, ran every yellow light, pulled into my parking garage and sat in my car for an hour because I couldn't make myself get out. The things he'd said kept circling through my mind, impossible and terrifying, and somehow, in the deepest part of me, ringing with a truth I didn't want to acknowledge. I'd been 19, I'd been desperate, and I'd said words into the darkness without thinking about what might be listening. Now something was collecting, and I had no idea how to stop it. I called in sick the next day and spent the morning searching for answers I wasn't sure existed. Crossroads deals, demons at intersections, bargains made without knowing. The internet gave me a flood of results, folklore from a dozen cultures, legends about entities that waited at the places where paths converged, stories of travelers who'd traded futures for favors without understanding the cost. The details varied, but the core remained the same. Crossroads were liminal spaces, thresholds between worlds, places where deals could be struck with things that didn't belong to the daylight hours. And the price was always the same: the person who'd made the bargain. I found a forum buried deep in the search results, a community of people who claimed to have encountered similar entities. Most of the posts read like fiction or delusion, but a few stood out, detailed accounts from people who seemed genuinely terrified, who described the same impossible appearances, the same knowledge of names and histories, the same patient inevitability that I'd seen in the man's smile. One user, posting from an account that had been inactive for 3 years, described almost exactly what I'd experienced. He shows up at red lights, always red lights. He knows things he shouldn't know. He says I made a deal when I was 17, that I promised something in exchange for my mother surviving her surgery. I don't remember saying the words, but I remember wanting it so badly I would have said anything. I've been running for 2 years. I don't know how much longer I can keep running. The user's last post was a single line, dated 6 months after the one before it. He found me. If anyone reads this, don't stop at red lights. Run them all. It's the only way. There were no posts after that. I tried to contact other users from the forum, sent private messages to anyone whose story matched mine, even slightly. Most accounts were dead, abandoned years ago, but one responded within hours. A woman named Claudette who lived 3 states away and picked up the phone when I called the number she'd provided. "You're new to this," she said, and there was no warmth in her voice, only the flat exhaustion of someone who'd stopped hoping for rescue long ago. "Let me guess. You made some kind of wish when you were young, probably didn't even realize you were doing it, and now he's coming to collect. How do you know about him? How long has he been following you?" 8 years. She laughed, a hollow sound. I was 22, drunk at a New Year's party, standing at an intersection at midnight saying I'd trade my soul for the guy I loved to love me back. Stupid. The kind of thing you say when you're young and don't know that words have weight. A pause. He started showing up about 5 years later, right after the guy I'd wished for left me for someone else. I guess the deal fulfilled itself, so it was time to pay. "How are you still?" I couldn't finish the question. "Alive? Free?" Claudette's voice hardened. "I don't drive, at all. Haven't been behind a wheel in 3 years. I take buses, trains, walk when I have to. He can only collect at a crossroads while you're stopped in your car. That's the threshold he needs. As long as I'm not the one controlling when I stop. He can't lock onto me." I thought about my life, my career, the job that required me to drive constantly, to meet clients all over the city, to navigate a web of streets and intersections that suddenly felt like a minefield. I can't just stop driving. My entire livelihood depends on it. Then find another livelihood. Claudette's tone left no room for argument. Or find a way to break the deal. I've been looking for 8 years and haven't found anything that works, but maybe you'll have better luck. Just know that every time you stop at a red light, you're giving him another chance. And eventually, your luck runs out. She hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat in my apartment, staring at the phone, the weight of her words settling over me like a shroud. 8 years of hiding from something that had all the time in the world. 8 years of restructuring her entire existence around avoiding crossroads. That wasn't a life. It was a prison sentence, served in the open air. I couldn't accept that. Wouldn't accept it. There had to be another way. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about Crossroads entities and the deals they made. Most sources agreed that the bargains were binding. Once the words were spoken, the contract was sealed, and no amount of regret could undo it. But a few texts, older and stranger than the rest, suggested that the deals weren't truly complete until both parties had fulfilled their obligations. The entity granted the wish, the human paid the price. If the wish was somehow undone, negated, returned, the debt might be canceled. I thought about what I'd wished for at 19, to get the job, to stop being afraid. Both had come true, in their way. I'd gotten the receptionist position that had launched my career, and I'd learned to push through the fear that had paralyzed me as a teenager. But the fear was back now, stronger than ever. And the career I'd built felt less like an accomplishment and more like bait. A life designed to keep me behind the wheel of a car, stopping at intersection after intersection, giving the entity endless opportunities to claim what I owed. Maybe that was the point. Maybe the wish hadn't just gotten me the job. It had set me on a path toward exactly this moment, driving alone at night, vulnerable and exposed, trapped in a pattern I couldn't escape. If I wanted to break the deal, I had to break the pattern. I quit my job the next morning, sold my car the day after that, moved out of my apartment and into a building downtown, walking distance from everything I needed, no intersections I'd have to cross in a vehicle. I remade my life completely, burning down every structure I'd built over 12 years, returning myself to the terrified girl I'd been before any of this started. And for 2 months, it worked. No appearances, no smiles in my rearview mirror, no voice telling me to unlock the door. Then one evening, walking home from the grocery store, I stopped at a crosswalk and waited for the light to change. A car pulled up beside me, its window already rolling down. And there he was, sitting in the passenger seat, smiling at me through the open window. Did you really think it would be that easy, Vera? A deal is a deal, and you still owe me. I ran, dropped my groceries on the sidewalk and sprinted down the street, weaving between pedestrians who shouted at me in surprise and annoyance. Behind me, I heard the car door open, heard footsteps that matched my pace no matter how fast I moved. He wasn't running. The rhythm was too steady, too unhurried. But somehow he was keeping up, his presence a cold weight at my back that I couldn't shake. I ducked into a coffee shop, pushed past the line of customers, and locked myself in the single-stall bathroom at the back. Sat on the floor with my knees drawn up to my chest, listening to my own ragged breathing, waiting for the knock on the door that would tell me he'd followed me inside. It didn't come, not in the first minute, or the 5th, or the 20th. When I finally worked up the courage to crack the door open and peer out, the coffee shop was exactly as it had been. Customers ordering drinks, baristas calling out names, no sign of a man in a dark coat with a smile that promised the end of everything. But I knew he wasn't gone. He'd proven that the rules I thought I understood meant nothing. He didn't need me to be in a car. He didn't need me to be driving. All he needed was a crossroads, any crossroads, and my presence on the wrong side of the threshold. I called Claudette that night from my apartment, hands still shaking, voice barely steady. She didn't answer. The number I'd saved was disconnected, a recorded message telling me the line was no longer in service. I tried the forum, but her account had been deleted, not just inactive, but scrubbed completely, like she'd never existed at all. I was alone. Whatever resources I'd thought I had, whatever community of survivors I'd hoped to lean on, they were gone. Either they'd found their own ways out, or they'd been collected one by one at crossroads they couldn't avoid. I spent that night researching again, digging deeper than I had before, looking for anything that might explain how to break a deal with something that didn't play by any rules I understood. Most of what I found was useless, rituals that required ingredients I couldn't obtain, prayers to deities I didn't believe in, advice to simply accept one's fate and hope for mercy. But buried in an academic paper about liminal folklore, I found a passage that made me stop scrolling. The crossroads bargain is predicated on an exchange of value. The supplicant offers something of worth. The entity grants something in return. However, accounts from multiple traditions suggest that the bargain may be nullified if the supplicant can demonstrate that the entity's gift was without value. That is, if the wish, when fulfilled, brought harm rather than benefit. The debt cannot be collected for a gift that was, in truth, a curse. I read the passage 3 times, letting the words sink in. The entity had granted my wish. I'd gotten the job, built the career, overcome the fear that had paralyzed me as a teenager. But had any of it actually helped me? I'd spent 12 years working myself to exhaustion, driving alone through empty streets, building a life so isolated that no one had noticed when I'd disappeared from it. The job hadn't saved me from fear. It had just given me new things to be afraid of. The career hadn't made me happy. It had made me a target. Maybe the wish had never been a gift at all. Maybe it had been a trap from the beginning. I needed to tell him that. Needed to confront him, face to face, and make the argument that his gift was worthless, that he'd given me nothing worth collecting. It was insane, the thought of voluntarily seeking out the thing that had been hunting me, but it was also the only option I had left. The next morning, I walked to the intersection of Reeder and Vine. It was daylight, early enough that the streets were full of commuters, and the traffic lights cycled through their colors for cars that actually stopped at them. I stood on the corner where I'd first seen him, waiting, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands clenched at my sides. He didn't appear. Not in the first hour, or the second, or the third. The sun climbed higher, the crowds thinned, and I stood there like a fool, waiting for a monster who had apparently decided not to show. Then the clouds rolled in, thick and gray and unnatural, blocking the sun so completely that the street darkened to twilight in a matter of minutes. The traffic thinned, the pedestrians disappeared, and when the light at Reeder and Vine turned red, every car on the road pulled over and stopped, their engines dying, their drivers sitting motionless behind their wheels, like puppets with cut strings. He stepped out of the shadows between 2 parked cars, his coat somehow darker than the darkness around him, his smile already spreading across that pale face. "You came to me this time," he said, and there was something like pleasure in his voice. "That's unexpected. Most of them run until they can't run anymore. But you want to negotiate. I want to tell you that your gift was worthless." My voice shook, but I forced the words out anyway. I wished to stop being afraid, and I've never been more terrified in my life. I wished for the job, and it made me miserable. Everything you gave me turned to poison. You didn't fulfill your end of the bargain. You cursed me. His smile didn't waver. "Is that what you think happened?" "It's what I know happened." He took a step closer, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees. "Then let me clarify something for you, Vera. I didn't give you the job. I didn't make you build a career that consumed your entire existence. All I did was remove the fear, just for a moment, just long enough for you to walk into that interview with confidence instead of panic. What you built after that was your choice. What you became was your own doing." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. "That's not..." "I gave you exactly what you asked for. One moment of courage, one chance to become the person you wanted to be. And you took that chance and ran with it for 12 years, never once stopping to wonder why you suddenly felt so brave, never once questioning the gift you'd received." His smile widened. "The deal was fair, the price is due, and now, Vera, it's time to pay." The frozen drivers in their frozen cars seemed to lean toward us, an audience waiting for the final act. The sky pressed down like a lid, and the light at Reeder and Vine stayed red, 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 refusing to change, refusing to give me any escape. "Unless," he said, and his voice dropped to something almost gentle, "you'd like to make another deal." Another deal. The words hung in the frozen air between us, shimmering with possibility, with danger, with the seductive promise of escape. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted me to take it, wanted me to dig myself deeper into whatever pit I'd fallen into at 19. One deal had bound me to him for 12 years. Another would bind me forever. What kind of deal? I heard myself ask, and hated the weakness in my voice. Simple. I release you from the original debt, completely, permanently, no strings attached. In exchange, you give me someone else. A name, an address, someone who's made a wish at a crossroads without knowing what they were doing. There are so many of them, Vera. The world is full of desperate people saying desperate things at desperate hours. Give me one, and you walk free. Someone else. A stranger who'd spoken careless words into the darkness, who'd wished for love or money or health without understanding the cost. I could save myself by condemning them to the same nightmare I'd lived through, the same endless running, the same inevitable collection, the same smile waiting at every red light. For a terrible moment, I considered it. The relief would be instant, absolute. I could go back to my life, rebuild everything I'd destroyed, pretend none of this had ever happened. All it would cost was a name, a single, anonymous name. But I'd been that name once. A scared teenager in a parking lot, wanting something so badly she'd whispered it to the universe without thinking. I'd been the desperate stranger, the easy target, the sacrifice on someone else's altar, and whoever came before me, whoever had given my name or my wish or whatever thread had connected me to this thing, they'd made the same choice I was being offered now. The chain had to break somewhere. It might as well be here. No, I said. His smile flickered. No? I won't give you someone else, and I won't make another deal. You said you gave me one moment of courage, fine. But courage isn't the absence of fear. It's being afraid and doing the thing anyway. I took a step toward him, my legs shaking, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I've been afraid this whole time. Every second of the last 12 years, I've been afraid of failing, afraid of being alone, afraid of being the person I was before that interview. You didn't take my fear away. You just taught me to ignore it. The frozen world around us seemed to shudder. The drivers in their cars remained motionless, but the shadows between them rippled like disturbed water. And now I'm done ignoring it, I continued. I'm afraid of you. I'm afraid of what you want from me. I'm afraid of dying, of being collected, of whatever happens to the people you take. But I'm standing here anyway, and I'm telling you no. Another step forward, close enough now to see my reflection in his lightless eyes. You gave me courage I didn't earn. I'm giving it back. Take it. The gift is returned. The deal is void. Something changed in his face. The smile was gone, replaced by an expression I'd never seen on those angular features. Confusion, frustration, something that might almost have been respect. That's not how this works, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. You can't just return. I already did. I was crying now, tears streaming down my cheeks, fear and relief and something like triumph all tangled together in my chest. I'm terrified. I've never been more scared in my entire life. That moment of courage you gave me, it's gone. I'm exactly the person I was at 19, standing in a parking lot, shaking so hard I can barely breathe. The only difference is that now I know being afraid isn't the worst thing in the world. Running from fear is the worst thing, and I'm done running. The sky cracked. Not thunder, something else, something deeper, like the sound of a contract tearing in two. The frozen cars shuddered back to life, engines starting, drivers blinking in confusion as they found themselves stopped in the middle of an intersection they didn't remember entering. The unnatural darkness began to lift, gray clouds thinning to reveal the ordinary overcast sky beyond. The entity looked at me with those empty eyes, and for the first time, I saw something other than hunger in them. Recognition, maybe, understanding. You'll still be afraid, he said quietly. For the rest of your life, you'll carry that fear. It won't go away just because you've accepted it. I know. Most people can't live like that. Most people break. Maybe. I held his gaze, steady despite the tears, steady despite the trembling in my hands. But at least I'll be living. At least I'll be free. He studied me for a long moment, the traffic flowing around us now, pedestrians passing without noticing the pale man in the dark coat or the crying woman facing him down in the middle of the crosswalk. Then, slowly, he smiled, a different smile this time, smaller and almost sad. Until next time, Vera Okonkwo. He stepped backward into the space between two passing cars, and when they'd gone, he was gone too. Just empty sidewalk and ordinary traffic and a red light that finally turned green. I walked home in a daze, the fear still thrumming through my body, the tears still drying on my cheeks. The world looked different now, sharper, more dangerous, full of crossroads I'd have to navigate without the armor I'd been wearing for 12 years. But it also looked more real, more mine. I rebuilt my life again over the following months, but differently this time. Found a job I could walk to, one that didn't require late nights or empty streets. Made friends with my neighbors, called my mother more often. Stopped treating solitude like safety. The fear never went away. He'd been right about that. But I learned to carry it instead of running from it. Learned that being afraid didn't mean being weak. It just meant being human. I still avoid crossroads when I can, still feel my heart lurch every time a traffic light turns red. And sometimes, late at night, I think I see a pale face in the window of a passing car, watching me with eyes that remember what I almost gave away. But I don't run anymore. I stand still, and I breathe through it. And I remind myself that courage was never something he gave me. It was something I had all along. I just needed to be afraid enough to find it. Story 4. The file with my handwriting that I didn't write. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. The same cramped letters, the same distinctive way I crossed my T's with a slight upward slant, the same habit of not fully closing my A's so they looked almost like U's. I'd recognize my own handwriting anywhere, the way you recognize your own face in a mirror. But I was looking at pages I'd never seen before, filled with words I had no memory of writing. The file had turned up in a routine audit. I worked as a records coordinator for the city planning department, one of those invisible jobs that keeps bureaucracies running, filing permits, organizing archives, making sure 40 years of zoning decisions didn't get lost to water damage or misfiled into oblivion. It wasn't glamorous, but I liked the order of it, the satisfaction of putting things in their proper place. I'd been doing it for 7 years, and in all that time, I'd never found anything that made me question my own sanity. Until now. The file was labeled Morrison, Eleanor, 1987, tucked between two folders I'd been reorganizing in the basement archives. Standard stuff, planning applications, variance requests, the usual paperwork that accompanied any significant construction project. But clipped to the inside cover was a handwritten note, and when I saw the writing, I felt something cold slide down my spine. She knows what happened to the children. She's been hiding it for 37 years. When you find this, it will be time to make her answer. My handwriting, my exact handwriting, down to the way I always wrote my capital S with an extra curve at the top. But the note was dated March 3rd, 1987. I hadn't even been born until 1992. My name is Damon Reeves. I was 32 that autumn, living alone in an apartment I'd inherited from my grandmother after she passed, working a job that paid enough to keep me comfortable without demanding enough to keep me stressed. I'd never been an anxious person, never suffered from blackouts or memory issues or any of the psychological conditions that might explain finding my own handwriting on a document that predated my existence by 5 years. I was ordinary in almost every way, which made what I was looking at feel even more impossible. I took the note to my supervisor, a patient woman named Deborah who'd been managing the archives since before I was hired. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Where did you find this?" "Morrison file, 1987. It was clipped inside the front cover." "And you're sure you didn't—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "No, of course not." You would have been a child. I wasn't born yet, I said. March 1987. I didn't exist. Deborah set the note down on her desk and studied it again, her brow furrowed. The handwriting does look like yours, remarkably so, but handwriting analysis isn't an exact science. Similar styles, similar habits. Two people can have nearly identical writing if they learned the same way. I wanted to believe her, wanted to accept that some clerk from 1987 had happened to write exactly the way I did, had crossed their T's with the same upward slant, had left their A's just as open. But I'd spent 7 years handling documents, learning to recognize patterns and anomalies, training my eye to spot things that didn't belong, and everything about this note screamed that it belonged to me. I started researching Eleanor Morrison that afternoon, pulling the entire file and spreading it across my desk. She'd applied for a variance in 1987 to add a second story to her home on Crescent Avenue, a modest request that had been approved without incident. The paperwork was routine: surveys, architectural drawings, signatures from neighbors who had no objections. Nothing that suggested hidden children or 37-year secrets or anything worth writing cryptic notes about. But there was something else in the file. Another handwritten page, this one tucked between 2 survey documents, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. The same handwriting, my handwriting, filling an entire sheet with cramped, urgent text. You're going to find this. I know because I remember finding it. This is how it starts. The file leads to the house leads to the basement leads to the truth. You have to follow it, Damon. There's no other way. My name. The note had my name on it, written in my own hand, on paper that was yellowed with age and brittle at the edges, paper that had clearly been sitting in this file for decades. I checked the date at the top of the page, March 3rd, 1987, the same date as the first note. Written before I was born, addressed to me specifically, warning me about something I was apparently destined to find. My hands were shaking as I set the paper down. The logical part of my brain was screaming that this was impossible. A prank, a forgery, some elaborate hoax designed to make me question everything I knew about myself. But another part, deeper and older, was whispering that I'd seen this before, that I'd written these words, even though I couldn't remember when or how or why. I looked up Eleanor Morrison's current address. She was still alive, still living in the same house on Crescent Avenue, now 91 years old according to public records. The house she'd added a second story to in 1987, the house the notes said would lead to the truth. The notes I'd written, the notes I had no memory of writing. I should have taken the file to the police, or to a handwriting expert, or to anyone who might help me understand what I was looking at. Instead, I found myself copying down the address on Crescent Avenue, tucking it into my pocket, making plans I didn't remember deciding to make. Because the second note had been right about one thing. I was going to follow this. I had to. The words on that page didn't feel like a warning anymore. They felt like instructions. And some part of me, some part I didn't recognize, already knew exactly what came next. I drove to Crescent Avenue the next evening, telling myself I was just going to look, just going to see the house, confirm it existed, maybe get a sense of whether any of this made sense before I did anything drastic. The rational part of my brain was still insisting there had to be an explanation, a relative with similar handwriting, a prank by a co-worker who'd somehow aged the paper, anything except the impossible truth that I'd written notes before I was born. The house was a modest 2-story, exactly as the 1987 file had described. The second-floor addition was visible in the slightly different brick color, the seam where new construction met old. The yard was overgrown, but not abandoned, the porch light on despite the late hour. Someone was home. Eleanor Morrison, 91 years old, living alone in a house that my own handwriting claimed held secrets about children. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching the windows, trying to work up the courage to do something. Knock on the door, ask questions, demand answers about notes I couldn't explain and accusations I didn't understand. But what would I even say? An old woman answers her door at 9 o'clock at night, And I'm standing there with a 40-year-old file full of my own impossible handwriting, asking about children she supposedly knows something about. I was about to drive away when the porch light flickered off, then back on, then off again, in a pattern that felt deliberate. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. I didn't know Morse code, couldn't tell if it meant anything or was just an electrical fault, but something about it made my skin crawl, made me feel like I was being watched from behind those dark windows. I drove home and didn't sleep that night. Just lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through explanations that didn't hold together, trying to remember anything from my past that might explain what I'd found. My grandmother had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 4. She'd never mentioned anyone named Morrison, never talked about Crescent Avenue, never given any indication that our family had secrets worth hiding in city planning files, but she had given me this apartment. And the next morning, when I started searching through her old things, boxes I'd never fully unpacked after she passed 3 years ago, I found something that made everything worse. A photograph, black and white, creased from handling, showing a group of children standing in front of a house I recognized. 7 children, ranging from maybe 5 to 12 years old, all of them staring at the camera with expressions that seemed too serious for their ages. The house behind them was Eleanor Morrison's house. I was certain of it, could match the window placement and the distinctive shape of the porch to what I'd seen the night before. On the back, in handwriting that made my stomach drop, was a single line. The ones who didn't come home. 1952. The handwriting was mine, identical to every other sample I'd found, the same cramped letters and unclosed A's and upward slanting T's. But this photograph was from 1952, 40 years before I was born, held by my grandmother for God knows how long, annotated in writing that shouldn't exist. I called in sick to work and spent the day digging through my grandmother's belongings with a desperation that bordered on mania. I found more photographs, more notes, more evidence of a history I'd never known existed. My grandmother, as a young woman, standing with a group of other women outside a building that looked institutional. A newspaper clipping from 1953 about a fire at something called the Crescent Avenue Children's Home. A list of names, 7 of them, matching the number of children in the photograph, with dates next to each one. Birth dates and death dates, all of them dying in 1952, all of them under 13 years old. And at the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper like something precious, another note in my handwriting. You're going to find this when the time is right. Everything you need is in the basement. Eleanor was the matron. She locked the doors. She let them burn. And now you're going to make sure everyone knows. The basement. The notes kept mentioning a basement. First Eleanor's, now this. I looked around my apartment, at the floor beneath my feet, and realized something that should have occurred to me hours ago. This building had a basement. My grandmother's building, now my building, had a basement I'd never once entered in the 3 years I'd lived here. I found the key on my grandmother's old key ring, a rusted thing I'd always assumed went to something that no longer existed. The basement door was in the back hallway, behind a shelf I'd never thought to move. When I turned the key in the lock, I felt something shift in the air around me. A pressure change, like ears popping on an airplane, like crossing a threshold into somewhere else. The stairs were old wood, creaking under my weight, descending into darkness that my phone's flashlight barely penetrated. The smell hit me before I reached the bottom, must and decay and something chemical underneath, something that made me think of old photographs and developing fluid. The basement was larger than I'd expected, stretching out under the entire building, filled with shapes I couldn't quite identify in the dim light. My flashlight beam swept across boxes and old furniture and the accumulated debris of decades. Then it caught something on the far wall, and I stopped breathing. A corkboard, covered in photographs and newspaper clippings and handwritten notes, connected by strings like some kind of conspiracy map. And in the center, pinned beneath everything else, was a photograph of me. Not a recent photograph. A photograph of me as I looked right now, same age, same face, same clothes I was wearing at this very moment, standing in this exact basement, holding this exact flashlight, staring at this exact corkboard. The photograph was dated on the back, March 3rd, 1987, 37 years ago, before I existed. And somehow, impossibly, I'd been here before. I don't remember sitting down, but I found myself on the cold concrete floor, the photograph clutched in my hands, my flashlight beam trembling against the far wall. The rational part of my brain had gone quiet, replaced by something older and stranger, a recognition that bypassed logic entirely. I knew this place, not because I'd been here before in any way that made sense, but because some part of me had always been here, waiting for the rest of me to catch up. The corkboard held decades of research, all of it in my handwriting, all of it impossible. Newspaper clippings about the Crescent Avenue Children's Home fire, annotated with notes that filled in details the articles had left out. Photographs of Eleanor Morrison at various ages, from a stern-faced young woman in a matron's uniform to the elderly figure I'd glimpsed through darkened windows. A hand-drawn map of the children's home, with one room circled in red and labeled where she locked them in. And everywhere, connecting everything, that same cramped handwriting I saw every time I signed my own name. I started reading the notes, piecing together a story that had been hidden for 70 years. The Crescent Avenue Children's Home had been a private orphanage operating from 1945 to 1953, housing children whose parents had died or abandoned them. Eleanor Morrison had been its matron, the woman responsible for their care, their education, their daily lives. And according to the notes on the corkboard, she'd been responsible for their deaths. The fire had started in the middle of the night in a storage room on the ground floor. 7 children had been trapped in a dormitory on the second floor, unable to escape because the door had been locked from the outside. The official investigation had ruled it an accident. Faulty wiring, tragic circumstances, no one to blame. But someone had blamed Eleanor Morrison. Someone had spent decades gathering evidence, documenting her crimes, preparing a case that had never been brought to light. My grandmother. It had to be my grandmother. She'd kept the photograph. She'd lived in this building. She'd held on to these secrets until she died. But the handwriting wasn't hers. I'd seen my grandmother's handwriting countless times, on birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes she'd left around the apartment. It was nothing like mine. At the bottom of the corkboard, pinned beneath a layer of other documents, I found a letter. It was addressed to me, my full name, Damon Reeves, written in that same impossible hand, and dated December 1986, 3 months before the notes in the file. If you're reading this, you've followed the trail. Good. That means everything is happening the way it's supposed to. I know you're confused. I was confused too the first time. But there's no time to explain everything. Time is exactly what we don't have or have too much of, depending on how you look at it. Here's what you need to understand. You're not crazy and you're not being tricked. You wrote these notes because you're going to write these notes. The loop closes when Eleanor Morrison answers for what she did. Until then, you keep coming back, keep finding the file, keep making your way here. I've done this more times than I can count. You will too, unless you end it. Go to Eleanor's house, go to her basement, find what she's hidden there, the evidence that will prove what she did, that will finally give those children justice, and then make sure the world knows. That's the only way out. That's the only way any of this stops. I'm sorry I can't explain more. I'm sorry you have to carry this, but you're the only one who can. You've always been the only one. The letter wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I'd written it. Some version of me, caught in a loop I was only beginning to understand, had written these words decades before I was born and left them here for me to find. I thought about what the letter said. I've done this more times than I can count, and felt something cold settle into my bones. How many times had I lived this? How many versions of me had found the file, followed the trail, ended up in this basement staring at evidence of my own impossible existence? And if none of them had broken the loop, what made me think I could? But there was another possibility, one that the letter seemed to suggest. Maybe none of the previous versions had actually completed the task. Maybe they'd gotten scared or confused or died before they could finish what they'd started. Maybe the loop kept resetting because the job wasn't done yet, because Eleanor Morrison was still alive, still unpunished, still holding on to secrets that needed to be exposed. I looked at the photograph of myself again, standing in this exact spot, wearing these exact clothes. The expression on my face was determined, almost fierce. Not the face of someone about to give up. The face of someone who'd finally understood what they had to do. I left the basement as the sun was coming up, my head spinning with implications I couldn't fully process. But one thing was clear. I had to go back to Eleanor Morrison's house. Not to watch from my car, not to wonder about flickering porch lights, but to find whatever she'd hidden in her basement and bring it into the light. The children in that photograph, the ones who didn't come home, had been waiting 70 years for someone to tell their story, and somehow, across decades I hadn't lived through yet, I'd volunteered to be the one to tell it. I drove to Crescent Avenue that afternoon, the letter from myself folded in my pocket, the address burned into my memory. The house looked different in daylight, smaller, less threatening, the kind of place where an old woman might live out her remaining years in quiet anonymity. But when I walked up the porch steps and knocked on the door, the woman who answered wasn't old at all. She was young, maybe 30, maybe less, with dark hair and pale eyes and a face I'd seen in photographs from 1952. Eleanor Morrison, looking exactly as she had 70 years ago. "I've been wondering when you'd come," she said, and smiled. "You're right on schedule. You always are." She stepped aside and gestured for me to enter, as casual as if I were an expected guest arriving for tea. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get back in my car and drive until Crescent Avenue was just a memory. But the letter in my pocket pressed against my chest like a heartbeat, reminding me why I was here. The children who didn't come home, the justice they'd been waiting 70 years to receive. I walked into Eleanor Morrison's house. The interior was immaculate, decorated in a style that could have been from any decade. Timeless furniture, neutral colors, nothing that anchored it to a particular era. Eleanor led me to a sitting room and gestured toward a chair, then settled onto a sofa across from me with the poise of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "You have questions," she said. "You always do at this point. How am I still young? How do I know about the loop? How many times have we done this?" She tilted her head, studying me with those pale eyes. "The answers never satisfy you, but I'll give them anyway, because that's how this goes." "Then give them." "The children died in 1952. You know that part already. The fire, the locked door, the 7 little bodies they pulled from the wreckage." Her voice was flat, clinical, as if she were describing something that had happened to strangers. "What you don't know is what happened after, what they became, what they did to me." She stood and walked to the window, her back to me, her silhouette framed against the afternoon light. "They didn't pass on, Damon. They couldn't. The door was locked, you see. Not just the physical door, but something else. Something I did without meaning to, without understanding. I trapped them in the moment of their deaths. And in doing so, I trapped myself as well." "You're saying they're still here, the children?" "In a sense, they're not ghosts, not exactly. They're more like echoes, reverberations of a wrong that was never made right." She turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something other than calm confidence in her expression, something that might have been fear. They've been trying to expose what I did since the night they died, but they can't interact with the physical world directly. They can only work through someone who's connected to them, someone whose bloodline intersects with theirs. My grandmother, the photographs she'd kept, the apartment she'd lived in, the secrets she'd carried. My grandmother was one of them, one of the children. She was the 8th child in the dormitory that night, the one who survived because she climbed out a window while the others burned. Eleanor's smile returned, but it was bitter now. She never forgave herself for living, spent her whole life trying to find a way to bring me to justice, to give her friends the peace they deserved. But she couldn't do it alone, so she found another way. The loop. The loop. Eleanor nodded slowly. Your grandmother made a bargain with the children's echoes. She offered them her bloodline, her descendants, their time, their lives, in exchange for the power to reach across decades and plant the evidence that would eventually destroy me. Every generation, someone in her family finds the file, follows the trail, ends up exactly where you are now. She spread her hands, encompassing the room, the house, the weight of 7 decades. And every time, I stopped them, because the children made one mistake. They gave me access to the loop too. I remember every version, every attempt. And I've had 70 years to prepare. I thought about the letter in my pocket, written by a version of me who'd stood in this exact situation. I've done this more times than I can count. How many of those versions had Eleanor stopped? How many had died in this house, their efforts erased when the loop reset? Why tell me this? I asked. If you've won every time before, why explain it now? Because it doesn't matter. She walked toward me, and I forced myself not to flinch. You'll try anyway. You'll go to my basement, find the evidence I've hidden there, attempt to bring it to the authorities, and I'll stop you, the way I've always stopped you. The loop will reset. Another generation will find the file, and we'll do this again. Then why not just kill me now? Why let me get this far? Something flickered in her eyes, that fear again, buried beneath decades of false confidence. Because I can't, not until you've seen the evidence. That's the rule the children set when they created the loop. You have to have a chance, a real chance, however small, otherwise the bargain is void, and I lose everything I've gained. She was afraid. Beneath the calm exterior, beneath the certainty that she'd win again, Eleanor Morrison was afraid of me, afraid of what I might do if I actually made it to the basement, actually found whatever she'd hidden, actually managed to break the pattern that had been repeating for 70 years. I stood up. Then show me. Show me the basement. Give me my chance. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the sitting room. Then Eleanor smiled, a real smile this time, the smile of someone who'd been playing a game so long they'd forgotten how to do anything else. Follow me. She led me through the kitchen to a door I hadn't noticed before, painted the same color as the walls, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. Behind it, stairs descended into darkness, the smell of damp earth and something older rising up to meet us. The evidence is down there, she said, stepping aside. Everything you need to prove what I did. The children made sure of that. They wanted someone to find it, to finally tell the truth. Her hand found my arm, her grip surprisingly strong. But so is something else, something I've had 70 years to prepare. Every version of you has gone down those stairs, Damon. None of them have come back up. I looked at the darkness below, at the stairs that had swallowed every previous attempt to end this cycle. The letter had said the loop only broke when Eleanor answered for her crimes. It hadn't said anything about survival. Then I'll be the first, I said, and started down the stairs. Behind me, Eleanor's voice drifted down like smoke. That's what you always say. The darkness swallowed me whole, and somewhere below, I heard the sound of children laughing. The basement was older than the house above it, the walls rough stone instead of concrete, the ceiling so low I had to duck to avoid wooden beams that had been holding up the structure since long before Eleanor Morrison was born. My flashlight cut through the darkness in uneven sweeps, illuminating fragments of a space that seemed to shift and change at the edges of my vision. Boxes and old furniture, a rusted furnace that hadn't worked in decades, and at the far end, barely visible in the weak light, a door. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a silence that felt expectant, watching. I could feel them around me, the children, the echoes, whatever was left of the 7 souls who'd burned while Eleanor held the key. They weren't hostile, they were hopeful. They'd been waiting 70 years for someone to walk through that door and finish what they'd started. I crossed the basement in a dozen careful steps, my shoes scraping against the dirt floor. The door was old wood, warped and swollen in its frame, secured with a padlock that looked newer than anything else down here. The key was hanging on a nail beside the frame. Too easy, too obvious. Exactly the kind of trap that had probably killed every version of me that came before. But I didn't have a choice. The evidence was behind that door. The children needed me to find it. And Eleanor was waiting upstairs, confident that whatever she'd prepared would stop me the way it had always stopped me. I took the key and unlocked the padlock. The door swung open on hinges that screamed with rust, revealing a space beyond that my flashlight couldn't fully penetrate. I stepped through, and the door slammed shut behind me. Darkness, complete and absolute, swallowing my flashlight like it had never existed. I fumbled with the beam, smacked it against my palm, but nothing happened. The batteries had been fresh this morning. Now they were dead, drained by something that didn't care about rational explanations. Then the lights came on. Not electric lights, something older, warmer, the flickering glow of gas lamps mounted on stone walls. I was standing in a room that couldn't have fit beneath Eleanor's modest house, a room that stretched out in all directions like a cathedral built underground, and covering every surface, every wall, every pillar, every inch of the floor that wasn't occupied by my feet, were photographs. Children, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, frozen in black and white images that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. They weren't just the 7 from 1952. They were others, going back further than I could comprehend. Generations of lost children whose deaths had never been answered for. Eleanor Morrison hadn't just killed once. She'd been killing for as long as this loop had existed, feeding on the power of broken bargains and unanswered justice. In the center of the room, on a pedestal that looked like an altar, was a box. Simple wood, no lock, no decoration. I walked toward it, my footsteps echoing in the impossible space, and I understood without being told that this was what I'd come for. The evidence, the proof, the key to breaking a cycle that had been spinning since before I was born. I opened the box. Inside was a key, old iron, rusted, nearly black, with a tag attached by a faded ribbon. The tag read, "Dormitory B, do not duplicate." The key Eleanor had used to lock 7 children in a burning building. The key she'd kept as a trophy, as proof of what she'd done, as the anchor that held the whole loop in place. I picked it up, and the room exploded with sound. Screaming, not the children, Eleanor, somewhere above me, her voice tearing through the stone and earth like it was paper. The walls shook, the photographs began to fall, glass shattering, images scattering across the floor. I ran for the door, the key clutched in my hand, knowing without understanding that I had to get out, had to get this evidence into the light before the whole structure collapsed. The door was gone, just smooth stone where it had been, no seam, no handle, no escape. I was trapped, the same way every version of me had been trapped, the same way those children had been trapped 70 years ago. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder, small, cold, a child's hand tugging me toward a section of wall I hadn't noticed before. I turned and saw them, all 7, standing in a semicircle, their faces serious and their eyes burning with something that wasn't quite life. The one who'd touched me, a girl, maybe 10 years old, with braids and a dress that had probably been blue before the fire turned everything to ash, pointed at the wall behind her. A window, narrow and high up, barely large enough for a child to squeeze through. The same window my grandmother had used to escape while her friends burned. I understood. They'd been waiting for this, not just for someone to find the key, but for someone to escape the way she had, to break the pattern by repeating her survival, by climbing through the window she'd left open for me across 7 decades of impossible time. I ran for the wall, jumped, caught the edge of the window with fingers that scraped against stone. The children pushed from below. I felt their hands, their strength, their desperate need for this to finally be over. I pulled myself through the opening and fell onto grass, cold and wet and real, the night sky spinning above me. The key was still in my hand. Eleanor's house collapsed behind me. Not all at once, a slow, groaning descent, the structure folding in on itself like something that had been held together by will alone and had finally been allowed to let go. I watched from the lawn as 70 years of hidden crimes sank into the earth, taking Eleanor Morrison with them. In the morning, I took the key to the police, told them a story they didn't quite believe, but couldn't quite dismiss, especially after they dug through the rubble and found what was left of Eleanor's collection. The photographs, the records, the evidence of crimes stretching back further than anyone had imagined. The children were never officially identified. The records were too old, too fragmented, too complicated by the impossible circumstances of their discovery. But the story made the news. People learned what had happened at the Crescent Avenue Children's Home, and somewhere, in whatever space exists between moments, I like to think 7 echoes finally found peace. I still have the file from work, the one that started everything, with my impossible handwriting on notes that predate my birth. But when I check it now, the pages are blank. The loop is closed. The words I wrote across decades have finally been erased because they no longer need to exist. Sometimes I wonder about the other versions of me, the ones who didn't make it through. I wonder if they're at peace too, or if they're still out there somewhere, caught in loops of their own. I wonder if I'll ever fully understand what my grandmother sacrificed to give me this chance. But mostly, I just try to live. To make the most of a timeline that finally belongs to me alone. To honor the children who waited 70 years for someone to tell their story. They didn't come home, but at least now they can rest. Story 5. The footsteps that followed me downstairs. The stairs in my grandmother's house always creaked, but they'd never creaked on their own before. I'd inherited the place 3 months earlier, after she passed quietly in her sleep at 94. The house was a Victorian monster at the edge of town, 4 stories of turrets and gables and rooms that seemed to multiply every time I tried to count them. I'd spent summers there as a child, running through hallways that smelled like lavender and dust, exploring an attic full of trunks and mysteries. Those memories were the only reason I hadn't sold it immediately. That, and some desperate hope that living in her house might make me feel close to her again. The first time I heard the footsteps, I was in the kitchen making coffee at 6 a.m. The staircase from the second floor to the first was directly above me, its old bones creaking and groaning whenever anyone walked on them. I knew that sound intimately, had memorized it during childhood visits, counting the steps from my bedroom to the bathroom, timing my midnight trips to avoid the loudest boards. So when I heard someone descending those stairs at 6 in the morning, I knew exactly what I was hearing. Except I was alone. Had been alone since moving in. Hadn't had a single visitor. Hadn't even introduced myself to the neighbors yet. The coffee maker gurgled beside me, and above my head, someone walked down the stairs. 1 step, then another, then another. 12 total. The exact number between floors, each one creaking in the exact sequence I remembered from 30 years ago. Then silence. Whoever had been walking had reached the bottom. I stood frozen at the counter, my heart hammering, every instinct screaming that I should grab a knife or run for the door or do anything except stand there waiting, but I couldn't move. Just listen to the silence settling back over the house, heavy and expectant, like the held breath before a scream. Nothing else happened. No doors opened, no footsteps crossed the hallway, no figure appeared in the kitchen doorway. After 10 minutes of standing motionless, I finally convinced myself to check the stairs. They were empty. The second floor was empty. The entire house was empty except for me, my pounding heart, and the echo of footsteps I couldn't explain. My name is Oliver Chen. I was 38 that autumn, recently divorced, recently laid off, recently relocated to a town I hadn't seen since childhood because I had nowhere else to go. My grandmother's house was supposed to be a temporary solution, a place to regroup while I figured out what came next. But I'd already started to suspect it would become something more permanent. The real estate market was bad, my savings were worse, and part of me had given up on the idea of moving forward. Living in the past, surrounded by my grandmother's furniture and my grandmother's memories, felt easier than facing a future I couldn't imagine. The footsteps became routine after that first morning. Every day, sometime between 6 and 7 a.m., I'd hear them descend the stairs from the second floor to the first. 12 steps, the same sequence, the same creaking boards in the same order. They never varied, never hesitated, never continued past the bottom of the stairs into any other part of the house. Just that same slow descent, repeated every morning, like clockwork. I tried to catch them, set up early, waited on the second floor landing, even slept on the stairs one night with my back against the banister. Nothing. The footsteps only happened when I was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't see the staircase directly. The moment I positioned myself to watch, they stopped. The moment I gave up and went to make coffee, they started again. I told myself it was the house settling. Old Victorians did strange things. Pipes knocked, floors shifted, wood expanded and contracted with the temperature in ways that could mimic human movement. I'd read articles about it, watched videos of old houses making sounds that seemed impossible. The human brain was wired to find patterns, to hear footsteps and random noise, to imagine threats where none existed. I was stressed, grieving, alone too much. Of course I was hearing things, but I didn't believe it. Couldn't believe it, no matter how many rational explanations I constructed. Because the footsteps were too perfect, too consistent, too clearly the sound of someone walking downstairs. And because, after the first week, they started getting closer. It began subtly. Instead of stopping at the bottom of the stairs, the footsteps continued. One extra creak, then two, then three. I mapped the sounds against my memory of the house's floor plan, tracking the progression from the base of the stairs toward the kitchen, toward me. Each morning, a little closer. Each morning, a little more certain that whatever was walking wasn't just descending the stairs anymore. It was coming to find me. By the end of the second week, the footsteps reached the kitchen doorway. I could hear them stop there, could almost feel the presence of something waiting just out of sight. I'd stand at the counter with my back to the door, too afraid to turn around, listening to the silence where footsteps should have been. Nothing ever appeared in my peripheral vision. Nothing ever made another sound. But I knew, with the certainty that bypasses logic and lives in the oldest parts of the brain, that something was standing behind me, watching, waiting for me to acknowledge it. I called my mother that night, the first time I'd spoken to anyone in weeks. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and worried, and for a moment I almost told her everything. But what would I say? That I was hearing ghosts in Grandma's house? That I was too scared to turn around in my own kitchen? Instead, I asked about the house's history, about who had lived there before my grandmother, about whether anything strange had ever happened, about any stories she might have heard growing up. She was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, careful, measured, the voice of someone choosing their words with precision. There's something you should know about that house, Oliver. Something your grandmother made me promise not to tell you until you were ready. She took a breath. You're not the first person to hear footsteps on those stairs. And your grandmother, she heard them too, every morning for 60 years. I gripped the phone tighter. What was it? What did she think it was? She didn't think, honey. She knew. Another pause, heavy with decades of kept secrets. The footsteps belonged to your grandfather, and he died falling down those stairs in 1962. My grandfather had been dead for over 60 years, and I'd never once heard his name spoken in that house. My mother told me the story that night, her voice carrying the weight of secrets she'd been holding since before I was born. Henry Chen had been 43 when he died, a fall in the middle of the night. a broken neck at the bottom of the stairs, my grandmother finding him in the morning when she came down to start breakfast. The official cause was accidental death, a misstep in the dark, the kind of tragedy that happens in old houses with steep stairs and no handrails. But my grandmother had never believed it was an accident. She'd believed, until the day she died, that something in that house had pushed him. She started hearing the footsteps a week after the funeral, my mother said. Every morning, the same time Henry used to wake up and come downstairs for his coffee. She thought she was going crazy at first. Then she thought it was a blessing. Henry's spirit, staying close, refusing to leave her alone. But after a few years, she started to change her mind. Why? Because the footsteps started getting closer, just like you described. First the stairs, then the hallway, then the kitchen door. It took almost 10 years, but eventually they reached her. My mother's voice trembled. She said she felt him standing behind her one morning, felt his breath on her neck. And when she finally turned around, there was nothing there. But she knew. She knew he wasn't trying to comfort her. He was trying to tell her something. I thought about the presence I'd felt in the kitchen doorway, the weight of attention pressing against my back. What was he trying to tell her? She never figured it out. Spent 60 years listening to those footsteps, trying to understand what he wanted. She researched the house, dug through old records, interviewed neighbors who'd known Henry before he died. Nothing made sense. He'd been a good man, kind, quiet, devoted to his family. There was no reason for his ghost to be angry, no unfinished business she could identify. A long pause. Eventually, she just accepted it, learned to live with the footsteps the way you learn to live with a chronic illness. Some mornings were worse than others, but she never left. Said she couldn't leave him alone in that house, even if she didn't understand why he was still there. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen until midnight, thinking about my grandmother. 60 years of footsteps, 60 years of feeling her dead husband approach her from behind, never knowing what he wanted, never being able to give him peace. She'd carried that burden her entire adult life and never told me, never told anyone except my mother, and only then because she'd needed someone to know in case the truth ever became necessary. Now it was necessary. The footsteps had started for me, which meant whatever Henry Chen wanted, he thought I could provide it. Or maybe he'd simply transferred his attention to the new occupant, the way a predator shifts focus to easier prey. I started researching the next morning after the footsteps descended the stairs and stopped in the kitchen doorway where they'd been stopping for days. I dug through boxes my grandmother had left in the attic, searching for anything related to my grandfather's death. Most of what I found was mundane. Financial records, tax returns, the accumulated paperwork of a long marriage. But in a trunk beneath a pile of moth-eaten quilts, I found a folder labeled Henry in my grandmother's careful handwriting. Inside were newspaper clippings about the accident, the police report from 1962, and a series of handwritten notes my grandmother had made over the years. The notes were fragmented, difficult to follow, observations about the footsteps, theories about what might have caused Henry's fall, names of people she'd spoken to, and what they'd said. One name appeared multiple times, circled and underlined: Walter Briggs. I searched for Walter Briggs in my grandmother's other documents and found a single mention in a letter dated 1963, addressed to my grandmother from someone named Dorothy Vance. I know you've been asking about Walter, the letter read. I don't know what happened between him and Henry, but I know they argued the night before the accident. Walter came to our house afterward, upset about something. Wouldn't say what. He moved away a month later and never came back. I always thought that was strange. Walter Briggs, a man who'd argued with my grandfather the night he died, who'd been upset about something he wouldn't explain, who'd fled town as soon as the funeral was over. My grandmother had circled his name for 60 years, but never found out what he knew. I searched online for Walter Briggs, not expecting to find anything. The name was common, the trail was cold, and 60 years was a long time for someone to disappear. But I found him on the third page of results, an obituary from 2019, a town about 4 hours away. Walter Briggs, 91 years old, survived by his daughter, Patricia Briggs Morrison, and 2 grandchildren. Patricia Briggs Morrison had a phone number listed in the white pages. I stared at it for a long time, thinking about what I'd say, how I'd explain why a stranger was calling to ask about something that happened before most people alive today were born. Behind me, the floorboards creaked. Not on the stairs this time, in the kitchen itself, between the doorway and where I sat at the table, closer than they'd ever been, close enough that if I turned around, I might finally see what had been following me. I didn't turn around, just picked up my phone and dialed Patricia's number, my hands trembling, the presence at my back growing heavier with every ring. Someone answered on the 4th ring. "Hello? Mrs. Morrison, my name is Oliver Chen. I'm calling about your father, Walter Briggs." I took a breath, feeling the weight of 60 years pressing down on my shoulders. I need to know what happened between him and my grandfather, the night before Henry Chen died. The silence on the other end lasted so long, I thought she'd hung up. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I've been waiting for this call my whole life. I think it's time you knew the truth." Patricia Briggs Morrison was 73 years old and had been carrying her father's secret since she was 11. She told me the story in a voice that trembled between relief and exhaustion, the voice of someone finally setting down a weight they'd been holding for 6 decades. "My father and Henry Chen were best friends," she said. "They grew up together, went to school together, served in the same unit during Korea. When they came back, they were closer than brothers. Dad was the best man at Henry's wedding. He was there when your mother was born. There was nothing those 2 men wouldn't do for each other." Then what happened? Margaret. The name came out flat, empty of emotion. Your grandmother. Dad fell in love with her somewhere along the way. He never told anyone, never acted on it, never said a word. Just carried it around like a stone in his chest, watching his best friend live the life he wanted. For years, he thought he could handle it, thought he could be happy just being close to her, being part of their family. I thought about my grandmother, the woman who'd spent 60 years listening to footsteps she couldn't explain. Had she known? Had she ever suspected that her husband's best friend had been in love with her? The night before Henry died, Dad finally told him. Patricia's voice cracked. I don't know why. Something must have happened, some breaking point I never understood. But he went to your grandfather's house that night and confessed everything. The love he'd been hiding, the jealousy, the years of watching from the outside. He said he needed Henry to know, needed to stop lying to his best friend, even if it destroyed their friendship. What did Henry say? He forgave him. Patricia laughed, but it was a broken sound. That's the worst part. Henry listened to everything, and then he forgave him. Told Dad that feelings weren't choices, that he understood, that nothing had to change between them. They talked for hours, apparently. By the end of the night, Dad thought everything was going to be okay. The presence behind me shifted. I could feel it more clearly now, a pressure in the air, a coldness that seemed to radiate from a specific point just over my shoulder. Whatever was listening to this story, it wanted me to hear what came next. But it wasn't okay, I said. No. Patricia took a shaky breath. Dad left around midnight. Henry walked him to the door. They shook hands. Everything seemed fine. But when Dad got home, he couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about what he'd said, how he'd burdened his best friend with something that wasn't his to carry. Around 3 a.m, he decided to go back, to apologize again, to make sure Henry really was okay, to, I don't know, fix something that couldn't be fixed. I waited, the silence stretching between us like a thread about to snap. When he got to the house, the front door was open. He went inside and found Henry at the bottom of the stairs. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. But he wasn't alone. There was someone else there, standing over the body. A man Dad had never seen before, dressed in dark clothes, with a look on his face that Dad said he'd never forget. The man saw him, smiled, and then just walked past him. out the door, into the night, like nothing had happened. Who was he? Dad never found out. He was so shocked he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything except stand there while the stranger disappeared. By the time he recovered enough to check on Henry, it was too late. Henry was dead, his neck broken, and Dad was alone in the house with the body of his best friend. The cold behind me intensified. I could feel breath on my neck now. Not warm, not human, but unmistakably present. The footsteps had stopped because whatever was making them didn't need to walk anymore. It was already here, standing close enough to touch, listening to the truth it had been trying to reveal for 60 years. Why didn't he tell anyone? Who would have believed him? A strange man nobody else saw, vanishing into thin air. The police would have thought he was lying, or crazy, or worse, that he'd done it himself. He'd just confessed his love for his best friend's wife. If anyone found out he was at the scene, they'd have arrested him on the spot. Patricia's voice hardened. So he kept quiet. Let everyone think it was an accident. Moved away a month later because he couldn't stand to look at Margaret. Couldn't stand to live with what he knew and couldn't prove. He spent his whole life protecting himself. He spent his whole life being punished. The tears in her voice were audible now. Dad never forgave himself for leaving Henry there. Never forgave himself for staying silent while everyone mourned an accident that wasn't an accident. He told me the truth when I was 11 because he needed someone to know, someone to remember in case the truth ever mattered. And then he spent the next 62 years drinking himself to sleep, waiting to die, hoping that somehow Henry would forgive him. I thought about the footsteps, about my grandmother spending 60 years feeling her husband's ghost approach her, never understanding what he wanted. Henry hadn't been trying to haunt her. He'd been trying to tell her. The same thing he was trying to tell me now. The same story that had been locked away in Walter Briggs's guilt for over 6 decades. The man your father saw, I said slowly. The one standing over the body. Did he ever describe him in more detail? Tall, thin, dark hair, dark clothes, and his smile. Dad said his smile was the worst part, like he was enjoying himself, like killing Henry was the most fun he'd had in years. Patricia paused. Dad drew him once, when I was a teenager. Said he needed to get the face out of his head. I still have the drawing, if you want to see it. I need to see it. She agreed to scan and email it to me. We talked for a few more minutes, about her father, about my grandmother, about the strange way secrets travel through generations. And then we hung up. I sat at the kitchen table, waiting for her email, trying not to think about what was standing behind me. The email arrived 20 minutes later. I opened the attachment with trembling hands. The drawing was crude but detailed, the work of someone trying desperately to capture something burned into their memory. A tall man, thin and angular, with dark hair and darker eyes. A smile that looked wrong on a human face, too wide, too knowing. I recognized him immediately. He was standing in the photograph on my grandmother's mantel. The photograph from her wedding day in 1958, 4 years before Henry died. He was in the background, barely visible, watching the happy couple with that same terrible smile. He'd been there from the beginning, and somehow, impossibly, he was still here now. I pulled the wedding photograph from the mantel with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The image was faded, the colors washed out by 6 decades of sunlight, but the man in the background was unmistakable. Same angular face, same dark eyes, same smile that didn't belong on anything human. He was standing near the edge of the frame, half hidden behind a group of guests, watching my grandparents exchange their vows with an expression of hungry anticipation. No one else in the photograph seemed to notice him. No one was looking his way, reacting to his presence, acknowledging that he existed at all. He was just there, the way a shadow is there, present but unobserved, part of the scene without belonging to it. I went through every photograph in my grandmother's collection that night. The wedding album, The family portraits, the holiday snapshots, spanning decades of ordinary life. He wasn't in all of them, maybe 1 in 10, sometimes less, but he appeared often enough to form a pattern, always in the background, always watching, always smiling that terrible smile while the people in the foreground lived their lives without knowing they were being observed. The last photograph I found him in was from 1961, the year before my grandfather died. A summer barbecue in the backyard, my grandmother and grandfather standing by the grill, my mother as a toddler playing on a blanket in the grass. The stranger was visible through the kitchen window, standing inside the house, his face pressed close to the glass. He wasn't smiling in this one. He was staring at my grandfather with an intensity that made my stomach turn. He'd been hunting Henry for years, maybe longer, circling closer, watching and waiting for the right moment. The night Walter Briggs confessed his love, the night Henry's world shifted off its axis, the night he was emotionally vulnerable and distracted and alone. That had been the moment. The stranger had seen his opportunity and taken it. But why? What had my grandfather done to attract the attention of something like this? What made him worth hunting for years? The presence behind me had been silent throughout my search, but I could still feel it, that cold wait, that patient attention. Henry was waiting for me to understand. He'd been trying to tell my grandmother for 60 years, and now he was trying to tell me. "What did you do?" I asked the empty room. "What happened that made him choose you?" The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see my breath. The lights flickered, dimmed, steadied, and then, for the first time since the footsteps had started, I heard something other than creaking stairs. A voice. Faint and distant, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well, but unmistakably words. "I saw him." I turned around. The kitchen was empty, but the air seemed thicker somehow, charged with something that made my skin prickle. "You saw him? Where? When?" The stairs. The voice was stronger now, closer. He was waiting. I saw him, and I knew. I knew what he was. The pieces clicked together in my mind. Henry had seen the stranger that night, not as a background figure in a photograph, but face to face, standing in his own home. He'd recognized what he was looking at, understood the danger, and in that moment of recognition, he'd become a threat, something that needed to be eliminated before he could warn anyone else. "That's why he killed you," I said, "because you saw him, because you knew." "He feeds." The voice was directly behind me now, cold breath on my neck, the presence of my dead grandfather closer than he'd ever been. On jealousy, on guilt, on secrets that poison from inside. He finds families and he feeds on them for generations. Your grandmother, your mother, you. I thought about the divorce, the layoffs, the spiral of failures that had brought me back to this house. The jealousy I'd felt watching my friends succeed while I stagnated. The guilt I carried for not being there when my grandmother died. The secrets I kept from everyone. The lies I told myself about why my life had fallen apart. Had those feelings been natural, or had they been cultivated? Had something been feeding on me my whole life, fattening me up for a harvest I didn't know was coming? How do I stop him? The presence shifted, pulling back slightly, and I felt something like uncertainty emanating from it. I don't know. I've been trying to tell someone for 60 years. No one could hear me. No one could see. I can hear you now. I can see the photographs, the pattern. That has to mean something. It means he's getting ready. Henry's voice was fading, growing distant again. He fed on your grandmother's grief after I died. Fed on her loneliness, her fear, her confusion. Now she's gone and you're here, full of the same feelings, the same pain. He's been waiting for you, Oliver. You're the next meal. The lights flickered again, and I heard something else. Not from behind me this time, but from the front of the house. The creak of the front door opening. The soft thud of footsteps in the foyer. Not ghostly footsteps. Not the ethereal sound I'd grown accustomed to over the past weeks. Real footsteps. Physical. Present. "He's here," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible now. "I tried to warn you. I'm sorry. I tried." The cold presence vanished, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the photograph still clutched in my hands. I could hear the footsteps approaching, not rushing, not hurrying, just moving through the house with the patient confidence of something that had all the time in the world. I looked down at the photograph. The stranger's face stared back at me from the kitchen window of a barbecue 60 years past, his eyes dark and hungry and fixed on a man who would be dead within a year. The footsteps reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. I didn't want to turn around. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay frozen, to not acknowledge the presence, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I thought about my grandfather, trapped in this house for 60 years, trying to deliver a warning no one could receive. I thought about my grandmother, feeling his ghost approach her morning after morning, never understanding what he needed her to know. I wasn't going to make their mistake. I wasn't going to spend 60 years not looking. I turned around. The stranger smiled at me from the doorway, exactly as he'd smiled in every photograph, exactly as he'd smiled while standing over my grandfather's broken body. "Hello, Oliver," he said. "I've been waiting for you." He looked exactly like the photographs, unchanged by the 60 years between then and now. Tall and angular, with dark hair that seemed to absorb the kitchen light and eyes that held nothing I recognized as human. His smile stretched too wide, revealed too many teeth, and when he stepped into the room, the air itself seemed to recoil from his presence. "3 generations," he said, his voice smooth and cold, like silk over ice. "Your grandfather saw me, and that was inconvenient. But your grandmother, she never looked too closely, never asked the right questions, never really wanted to know. She let me feed for 60 years without ever understanding what was happening. And now, here you are, already so full of the things I like. Guilt, regret, the jealousy you pretend you don't feel, the secrets you keep even from yourself." I backed against the counter, my hands finding the edge, gripping it like an anchor. "What are you?" "Old." He moved closer, that terrible smile never wavering. "Older than this house, older than this town, older than the language you'd use to describe me. I've had many names over the centuries, but none of them matter. What matters is what I do. I find families with cracks in them, resentments, hidden shames, loves that shouldn't exist. And I make myself comfortable, feed on the pain as it passes from parent to child, from generation to generation. Your family has been particularly nourishing." The photograph was still in my hand. I looked down at it, at the stranger's face in the window, at my grandfather's smile in the foreground. Henry had seen this thing and recognized it for what it was. That moment of recognition had cost him his life. But it had also given him power. He'd spent 60 years in this house, watching, waiting, trying to communicate. Whatever force had kept him here, grief, guilt, unfinished purpose, it was stronger than what this creature had done to him. Henry Chen was still fighting, even from beyond death. "You made a mistake," I said. The stranger's smile flickered. "Did I?" "You killed my grandfather, but you didn't destroy him. He's still here. He's been here the whole time, trying to tell someone what you did. And now I know. Now I understand." I straightened, forcing myself to meet those empty eyes. "You feed on secrets, on things that stay hidden, but there's no secret anymore. Patricia Briggs knows. I know. The truth is out." "The truth?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think the truth matters? You think knowing what I am will protect you? Your grandfather knew, and look where it got him. Your grandmother suspected, and she spent 60 years too afraid to look. Knowing doesn't save you, Oliver. Knowing just makes the meal more interesting." He lunged, not walking, not running, just suddenly there, his hand closing around my throat, his face inches from mine. The cold was overwhelming, A freeze that went deeper than skin, deeper than bone, reaching for something essential at the core of me. I could feel him pulling, drawing out the guilt and regret and self-hatred I'd been marinating in for years, draining me like a vampire drains blood. But I could feel something else too. A warmth at my back. A presence I recognized. Henry, still here, still fighting, lending me whatever strength a ghost could give. "You want my secrets?" I gasped. "Take them. I'm done hiding." I thought about everything I'd been carrying. The shame of my failed marriage. Not because it ended, but because I'd been relieved when it did. The guilt over my grandmother's death. Not because I wasn't there, but because I'd stayed away on purpose, too afraid to watch her decline. The jealousy that had poisoned every friendship I'd ever had. The resentment I felt toward people who'd done nothing wrong except succeed where I'd failed. I'd been hoarding these feelings like treasures, feeding them in the dark, letting them grow into something monstrous. I let them go. Not easily. Nothing that painful is ever easy. But I opened the doors I'd kept locked, dragged the secrets into the light, and felt them lose their power as they stopped being hidden. The guilt was still there, but it was just guilt now, an emotion, not a prison. The shame was still real, but it was something I could acknowledge, could work through, could eventually release. None of it was worth protecting anymore. The stranger's grip faltered. His eyes widened, and for the first time I saw something other than hunger in them. Confusion. Fear. "What are you doing?" "Starving you." I grabbed his wrist, feeling the cold burn my fingers, and pushed. "You feed on secrets, on things people hide because they're too ashamed to face them. But I'm facing mine, right now, out loud, in the open. There's nothing left for you to eat." The cold intensified, then shattered. The stranger stumbled backward, his form flickering like a bad signal, his smile finally gone. Behind me, I felt Henry's presence surge forward, not attacking, not fighting, but simply being present, adding his acknowledgement to mine. 2 generations of truth, exposed at the same time, draining the poison this thing had fed on for decades. "This isn't over," the stranger hissed. "There are always more secrets, always more shame. Your family will make new ones, and I'll be waiting. Then I'll tell those too." I held up the photograph, the evidence of his presence, the proof that he'd been stalking us for generations. "And I'll make sure everyone knows to look for you. No more hiding, no more silence. You're done with the Chens." He screamed, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that rattled the windows and made the lights explode in showers of sparks. Then he was gone, not walking out the door, but simply ceasing to exist, erased from the kitchen like he'd never been there at all. The cold lifted. The lights steadied, though half of them had burned out. And in the sudden quiet, I heard one last sound. Footsteps, soft and fading, climbing the stairs instead of descending them, going up instead of down, moving toward rest instead of repetition. "Thank you," I whispered. There was no answer. There didn't need to be. I sold the house 3 months later, after making sure the new owners knew its history, the real history, not the sanitized version. I told Patricia everything that had happened, gave her copies of the photographs, made sure the truth was documented in as many places as possible. Secrets were what he fed on. Sunlight was what killed him. I still think about my grandfather sometimes, walking down those stairs every morning for 60 years, trying to reach someone who could hear him. I think about my grandmother, living with his ghost, loving him even when she didn't understand. And I think about the stranger, waiting in the shadows of family photographs, patient and hungry and eternal. He's still out there somewhere. Things like him don't die easily, if they die at all. But he won't find easy prey in my family again. We've learned to talk about the things that hurt. We've learned that secrets are more dangerous than truth. And if I ever see that smile in another photograph, I'll know exactly what to do. I'll drag it into the light and watch it burn.